Colorado Territory, 1876. A time when the West was still being tamed, when dreams were as vast as the open sky, and when second chances came at the price of leaving everything familiar behind. For women with limited prospects in the East, becoming a mail-order bride offered the promise of a new beginning, even if that beginning was built on carefully crafted letters and the faded photograph of a stranger. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But what happens when the woman who steps off the stagecoach bears the visible marks of a past tragedy? When the face that greets her intended husband causes him to recoil rather than welcome? This is the story of Clara Bennett, a woman whose scarred face concealed a spirit unbroken by tragedy or cruel judgment. A woman who traveled across half a continent seeking a fresh start, only to face humiliation on what should have been her wedding day, until Nathaniel Montgomery, the respected judge's son, stepped forward and changed both their destinies forever. In the harshest winter Cedar Springs had seen in decades, these two unlikely souls would discover that sometimes strength comes from unexpected quarters, that beauty reveals itself slowly to those patient enough to look beyond surface appearances, and that love, true love, sees with the heart when eyes fail to understand what they're seeing. Clara Bennett stood motionless as the stagecoach rumbled away, leaving her alone in the dusty main street of Cedar Springs. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the wooden boardwalks, and the cool mountain air carried the scent of pine and wood smoke. She kept her face partially turned away from the curious onlookers, a habit formed over 3 years of avoiding the shocked expressions and pitying glances her appearance inevitably provoked. Beneath her traveling bonnet, the right side of Clara's face bore the unmistakable evidence of the fire that had claimed her family home and her former life back in Boston. The scars pulled at her skin, creating an asymmetry that no amount of careful styling could fully conceal. At 24, Clara had resigned herself to a life of spinsterhood in a society that valued a woman's beauty above her character, until the advertisement in the matrimonial news had offered an unexpected alternative. "Miss Bennett?" A thin man approached, twisting his hat nervously in his hands. "I'm Pastor Miller. Mr. Fowler asked me to meet you and escort you to the boarding house." Clara turned fully toward him, bracing herself for the reaction. To his credit, the pastor's eyes widened only briefly before he composed his features into a careful neutrality she had come to recognize all too well. "Thank you, Pastor. That's very kind." Her voice was soft but clear, revealing the refined education her appearance often caused others to doubt. "I understand the wedding is scheduled for tomorrow afternoon?" "Yes, that's correct. Mr. Fowler has made all the arrangements." Pastor Miller gestured toward the boardwalk. "If you'll follow me, Mrs. Wilson runs the finest establishment in Cedar Springs. You'll be comfortable there until tomorrow." As they walked, Clara felt the weight of stares from the townsfolk going about their business. Cedar Springs was smaller than she had imagined from Jeremiah Fowler's letters. One main street lined with essential businesses, a church steeple rising against the backdrop of mountains, and scattered houses spreading outward like ripples in a pond. "Mr. Fowler was unable to meet you himself?" she asked, trying to ignore the whispers that followed in their wake. "He's completing preparations at Pine Valley Ranch," Pastor Miller explained, his gaze fixed firmly ahead. "It's about 5 miles outside of town. Finest cattle operation in the county, as he may have mentioned in his correspondence." Clara nodded. Jeremiah had indeed described his ranch in detail through their months of letter writing. The sprawling pastures, the sturdy house he'd built with his own hands, the prosperous future he envisioned with a sensible wife by his side. What she had shared of herself had been more carefully curated. Her skills as a housekeeper, her education, her capability with numbers and correspondence. The small daguerreotype she'd sent had been taken before the fire, showing a young woman with regular features and a serious expression. She had disclosed her scars in writing, of course. It would have been unconscionable to arrive under false pretenses, but words on paper rarely conveyed the full reality of such things. Mrs. Wilson's boarding house stood at the quieter end of the main street, a two-story clapboard building with a wide porch and window boxes filled with late blooming flowers. The woman who greeted them had a round face creased with laugh lines and sharp eyes that missed nothing. "So you're Mr. Fowler's intended," she said, giving Clara a thorough assessment. "Martha Wilson, welcome to Cedar Springs. Clara Bennett, thank you for your hospitality." Martha's gaze lingered on Clara's scars without flinching. "Pastor, I'll take charge of Miss Bennett now. I expect you've got sermon writing to attend to." Once the pastor had departed, Martha showed Clara to a small but comfortable room on the second floor. "Wash basins there, privies out back, suppers at 6 sharp." As Clara began to unpack her modest trunk, Martha remained in the doorway. "Fowler's a wealthy man by local standards," she said abruptly. "Not particularly well-liked, but respected for his business sense." Clara paused, a folded dress in her hands. "I see. Just so you know what you're walking into." Martha's direct gaze held something like concern. "This town runs on gossip. Like a mill runs on water. By sundown, everyone will know about your arrival. And my appearance," Clara added quietly. Martha gave a single firm nod. "People can be unkind about things they don't understand." "I'm familiar with unkindness, Mrs. Wilson." A smile fleetened the older woman's serious expression. "I expect you are, child. And it's Martha, if you please. Rest now. You look like you've carried the weight of that journey in every bone." Alone at last, Clara moved to the small mirror hanging above the washstand. Carefully, she removed her bonnet and unpinned her dark hair, letting it fall around her shoulders. The contrast never failed to unsettle her, the unmarked smoothness of the left side of her face against the rippled, reddened skin of the right, from cheekbone to jaw, narrowly skirting her eye but pulling slightly at the corner of her mouth. The face of a stranger, even after 3 years. She thought of Jeremiah Fowler, the man who would become her husband tomorrow. His letters had been practical rather than romantic, outlining his expectations for a marriage of mutual benefit. He needed a wife to manage his household, to bring civilization to his ranch, perhaps eventually to bear his children. In return, he offered financial security, a respectable position, and the promise of fair treatment. Not love. Clara had abandoned such girlish dreams in the aftermath of the fire. But perhaps respect could grow between them, even with her marred appearance. He had, after all, agreed to the match, despite her honest disclosure. Supper at Martha's boarding house proved to be a trial of endurance. The other guests, a traveling salesman, an elderly couple visiting their son's family, and 2 unmarried teachers from the local school, made valiant attempts not to stare at Clara's scars, resulting in an uncomfortable meal of averted gazes and stilted conversation. "Miss Bennett has traveled all the way from Boston," Martha announced as she served a hearty beef stew. "She's to marry Jeremiah Fowler tomorrow afternoon." "Fowler?" The salesman raised his eyebrows. "Didn't know the old bull had finally decided to take a wife." One of the teachers, a pinch-faced woman with steel-rimmed spectacles, studied Clara with undisguised curiosity. "You've corresponded with Mr. Fowler, I presume?" "For 6 months," Clara confirmed, forcing herself to meet the woman's gaze steadily. "How modern," the teacher replied, her tone suggesting she meant quite the opposite. Clara had weathered far worse scrutiny in Boston society. I believe many frontier marriages begin this way, given the circumstances. Indeed, Martha interjected, and Cedar Springs is fortunate to welcome educated Eastern ladies however they arrive. The pointed comment silenced further interrogation, though it did nothing to dispel the sidelong glances. After the uncomfortable meal concluded, Clara retreated to the small porch at the back of the boarding house, seeking solitude and fresh air. The sun had set behind the mountains, painting the sky in deepening shades of purple and indigo. In the distance, the silhouette of the courthouse rose against the darkening sky, its clean lines a testament to the town's aspirations toward permanence and civilization. "Mind if I join you?" Clara turned to find Martha approaching with 2 steaming cups. "Not at all." "Thought you might appreciate some tea after that inquisition disguised as supper," Martha said, settling into the chair beside Clara's. "People forget their manners when curiosity gets the better of them." "Thank you." Clara accepted the cup gratefully. "I'm accustomed to it." Martha studied her for a moment. "How did it happen, if you don't mind my asking?" "The fire." The direct question was refreshing after so many people who wondered but dared not inquire. 3 years ago, I awoke to smoke and flames. My father had fallen asleep with his pipe lit after working late in his study. I managed to get my younger sister out, but when I went back for my parents..." She touched her cheek lightly. "The ceiling collapsed. A neighbor pulled me out, but my parents were already beyond saving." "You went back in?" Martha's voice held new respect. Clara nodded. "Anyone would have." "I wouldn't be so certain of that," Martha replied quietly. "What happened afterward?" "My sister went to live with our aunt. I stayed to settle my father's affairs, but Boston held nothing for me anymore." Clara stared into her tea. "A scarred spinster has limited prospects, even with a modest inheritance." "So you answered Jeremiah Fowler's advertisement?" "One of several I considered. His letters seemed straightforward, honest. He didn't make flowery promises or profess instant devotion. And he didn't withdraw the offer when I disclosed my... Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." "In done condition." Martha's expression remained unreadable in the gathering darkness. "Jeremiah Fowler is a complicated man. Came here 12 years ago with nothing but determination and a mean streak wider than the Blue River. Built that ranch through sheer force of will and some business dealings that walked the line of legality." Clara absorbed this information carefully. "You're warning me." "I'm preparing you," Martha corrected. "He's not cruel as far as I know, but he's fixed in his ways and accustomed to being obeyed without question. Not an easy man to live with. I'd wager few men are, in my experience." Martha's laugh was sudden and genuine. "True enough. Just remember, child, whatever happens tomorrow or after, you have more steel in you than most realize. Anyone who walks back into a burning building has a core that won't break easily." That night, Clara slept fitfully, waking often to the unfamiliar sounds of the boarding house and the weight of anticipation. By morning, a nervous energy had taken hold of her. Not unlike the sensation before a thunderstorm, the certainty of change approaching for better or worse. Martha helped her prepare, lending a practiced eye as Clara donned her best dress, a modest creation of dove-gray silk, high-necked and trimmed with white lace at collar and cuffs. Her dark hair was arranged in a simple but elegant style that partially shadowed the right side of her face without appearing deliberately concealing. "No veil?" Martha asked as she secured the final hairpin. Clara shook her head. "It would seem dishonest somehow, as if I were trying to hide what he'll need to accept." Martha squeezed her shoulder lightly. "Brave girl." The church stood at the center of Cedar Springs, its white clapboard exterior gleaming in the midday sun. As Clara approached on Martha's arm, she noted the surprising number of people milling about outside, far more than she would have expected for a private ceremony. "Word travels fast in small towns," Martha murmured, correctly interpreting Clara's hesitation. "Jeremiah Fowler taking a bride is the most interesting thing to happen in Cedar Springs since the Gold Assayer's office opened last spring." Inside, the simple church was filled with curious townsfolk occupying the pews. At the altar, Pastor Miller stood solemn-faced next to a tall, broad-shouldered man with iron-gray hair and a severe expression. Jeremiah Fowler was older than Clara had imagined from his letters, closer to 50 than the 40 he had implied, with the weathered complexion of someone who spent his days outdoors and the hard eyes of a man accustomed to measuring everything in terms of value and use. As Clara proceeded down the aisle, a hush fell over the assembled onlookers. She kept her chin raised, her pace measured, ignoring the whispers that rippled through the church like wind through prairie grass. She fixed her gaze on Jeremiah Fowler, watching as his expression shifted from anticipation to visible shock as he registered her appearance. His reaction was brief but unmistakable. A widening of the eyes, a tightening of the mouth, a physical recoil so slight most might have missed it. But Clara, who had become an expert in reading the first moments of horror when people beheld her scars, recognized it instantly. Still, she continued forward. They had an agreement. He had been informed of her scars, even if words had failed to convey their extent. Surely a practical man like Jeremiah Fowler would honor his commitment. When she reached the altar, the silence in the church had grown oppressive. Jeremiah stared at her, making no effort to disguise his dismay as he took in the full reality of her disfigurement at close range. "Mr. Fowler," she said quietly, extending her gloved hand as Pastor Miller cleared his throat nervously. Jeremiah did not take her hand. Instead, he turned to the pastor with a coldness that sent a chill through Clara, despite the warmth of the crowded church. "This is not the woman whose photograph I received," he stated flatly, his voice carrying in the hushed space. "I agreed to marry a respectable woman from Boston, not—" He gestured vaguely toward Clara's face. "This." A collective gasp rose from the congregation. Clara stood perfectly still, her outstretched hands suspended in the air between them, humiliation washing over her in a wave so powerful it nearly robbed her of breath. "Mr. Fowler," Pastor Miller began, his discomfort evident. "Miss Bennett did disclose her condition in her correspondence, as I understand it." "Words on paper," Jeremiah dismissed harshly. "This is deception, plain and simple." "I assure you, sir," Clara managed, her voice remarkably steady despite the mortification burning through her, "I was entirely truthful about my appearance." Jeremiah's gaze raked over her with cold assessment. "I required a wife who could represent my household with dignity, who could help secure my position in this community, not someone who would make a spectacle of my name." He turned to address the congregation directly, as if presenting evidence in a courtroom. "I ask you all to witness that I am the injured party here, that I have been misled and manipulated." The murmurs from the pews grew louder. Clara felt the weight of dozens of stares, some pitying, others judgmental, a few openly curious about how this public humiliation would resolve itself. Her legs trembled with the effort of remaining upright, with the strain of maintaining dignity when every instinct screamed for her to flee. "Mr. Fowler," she said, summoning the last reserves of her composure, "I understand your disappointment. However, I have traveled nearly 2,000 miles based on our mutual agreement. I have spent nearly all my remaining funds to reach Cedar Springs." "That is hardly my concern," Jeremiah replied coldly. "Deception has consequences, Miss Bennett." "Dean." From somewhere in the crowd, a woman's voice called out, "Shame on you, Jeremiah Fowler." Clara recognized Martha's indignant tone, but the support, welcome as it was, only intensified her humiliation. "I believe we're finished here," Jeremiah announced, turning away from Clara as if dismissing a servant. "Pastor, my apologies for the inconvenience." As Jeremiah Fowler strode down the aisle, the congregation erupted in a chorus of whispers and exclamations. Clara remained at the altar, paralyzed by shock and the sudden, devastating awareness of her situation. Alone in a strange town, publicly rejected, with meager resources and nowhere to go. Pastor Miller touched her elbow gently. "Miss Bennett, perhaps we should... Excuse me." A clear, authoritative voice cut through the chaos of the church. "I'd like to speak with Miss Bennett." The crowd parted as a tall young man in a well-tailored suit made his way to the front of the church. Clara recognized him vaguely from the previous day. She had glimpsed him entering the imposing courthouse as she arrived on the stagecoach. "Nathaniel Montgomery," he introduced himself with a slight bow. "My father is Judge William Montgomery. If I might have a word with you privately, Miss Bennett." Clara nodded mutely, beyond questioning this unexpected intervention. She allowed herself to be led to a small anteroom off the main church, aware of the speculative gazes following their retreat. Once the door closed behind them, Nathaniel Montgomery turned to face her. He was perhaps 30, with intelligent blue eyes and the confident bearing of someone secure in his place in the world. Unlike most people, he looked directly at her, his gaze neither avoiding her scars nor dwelling on them with morbid fascination. "Miss Bennett, I apologize for the appalling behavior you've just endured," he said without preamble. "Jeremiah Fowler's actions reflect poorly on our town and on basic human decency. Thank you for your concern, Mr. Montgomery, but please call me Nate." He ran a hand through his light brown hair, a gesture that suggested genuine distress rather than practiced sympathy. "What Fowler did was unconscionable, and it leaves you in an untenable position, which I feel partly responsible for as a citizen of this community." Clara straightened her shoulders, gathering the tattered remains of her dignity. "You bear no responsibility for Mr. Fowler's decisions, Mr. Montgomery. Nate, and while I appreciate your kindness, I must now determine my next steps independently." "That's precisely what I wish to discuss." Nate hesitated, then continued, with careful deliberation. "I have a proposition that might solve your immediate dilemma, though I recognize it may seem unusual given the circumstances." Clara regarded him warily. "What sort of proposition?" "My father's health has been declining for the past year. He requires assistance that goes beyond what our housekeeper can provide. Correspondence, legal document preparation, household accounts. I've been searching for someone with the appropriate education and discretion." "And you believe I might fill this role?" Clara asked, surprised. "Your letters to Fowler demonstrated your literacy and education. Martha Wilson mentioned you managed your father's affairs after his passing, suggesting experience with practical matters." Nate's direct gaze held hers. "The position would include room and board at my father's house, which has a separate entrance to private quarters, plus a modest salary. It would provide you time to consider more permanent arrangements without immediate financial pressure." Clara studied him, searching for hidden motives or pity disguised as opportunity. "Why would you offer this to a complete stranger?" "Because my father taught me that justice isn't just about the law, it's about doing what's right when the opportunity presents itself." His expression softened slightly. "And because no one should have their dignity stripped away as publicly as yours was today." The offer was unexpected, potentially inappropriate by Eastern standards, and yet presented with a straightforward respect that Clara found herself responding to. It was not charity precisely, but an acknowledgement of her difficult circumstances coupled with a practical solution that might preserve her independence. "I would need to know more about the judge's expectations," she said finally. "And I would insist on a formal employment agreement." Nate's face broke into a surprised smile that transformed his serious features. "Of course, my father would expect nothing less." He extended his hand. "Do we have a preliminary understanding, Miss Bennett?" Clara hesitated only briefly before accepting his handshake. "We do, Mr. Montgomery. And under the circumstances, I believe you should call me Clara." As they emerged from the anteroom, the remaining churchgoers fell silent, watching with undisguised curiosity. Martha Wilson pushed forward immediately, protective concern evident in her bearing. "Clara, are you all right?" "Yes, Martha. Mr. Montgomery has made me a professional proposal that I've agreed to consider." Clara turned to Nate. "Perhaps we could continue this discussion at your father's home? I see little reason to prolong my stay here." Nate nodded, offering his arm with a formality that Clara appreciated for its simple dignity. "My father will be pleased to meet you." As they walked down the aisle together, Clara held her head high, aware of the shifting narrative already, taking shape around them in the whispers and speculative glances. No longer merely the rejected bride with the scarred face, she had somehow become part of a new story, one connected to the respected Montgomery name. Outside, the bright Colorado, sunshine seemed to mock the dark humiliation she had endured inside the church. Yet as they walked toward the courthouse square, where the judge's residence stood, Clara felt a curious lightness beginning to replace the crushing weight of Jeremiah Fowler's rejection. She had survived a burning house. She had rebuilt her life, once before from the ashes of tragedy. Perhaps here, in this small frontier town where she had just endured the worst public humiliation of her life, she might find an unexpected path forward. Not as someone's wife, but as herself, Clara Bennett, scarred but unbroken, facing the future on her own terms. Nathaniel Montgomery walked beside her in thoughtful silence, the straight lines of his posture suggesting a man governed by principles rather than impulses. Clara didn't know yet if she could trust him or his unexpected offer, but for the first time since stepping off the stagecoach, she felt something like hope stirring within her, fragile but persistent, like the first green shoot after a devastating forest fire. Judge William Montgomery's home stood as a testament to Eastern refinement transplanted to the Colorado frontier, a substantial two-story brick structure with a wide veranda and tall windows that looked out over Cedar Springs from its prominent position near the courthouse. Unlike the hastily constructed wooden buildings that dominated the town, the Montgomery residence had been built to last, much like the judge's reputation for unwavering fairness. As Clara followed Nathaniel up the flagstone path, she noticed the carefully tended flower beds, now dormant with the approach of winter, and the stately oak door with its polished brass fittings. This was a home built by someone who valued order and permanence. "My father may be resting," Nathaniel explained as he opened the door. "His condition leaves him fatigued in the afternoons, though he refuses to acknowledge any limitation." The interior of the house revealed tasteful furnishings that would not have been out of place in a Boston drawing room, oriental rugs over hardwood floors, leather-bound books lining built-in shelves, and landscape paintings in gilded frames. Yet there was a lived-in quality to the space that Clara found unexpectedly comforting after the sterile perfection of her aunt's home following the fire. "Sarah?" Nathaniel called. "Are you here?" A middle-aged woman with graying hair tucked beneath a pristine cap emerged from what Clara presumed was the kitchen, wiping her hands on a spotless apron. Her eyes widened slightly at the sight of Clara, but her expression remained professionally neutral. "Mr. Nathaniel, I wasn't expecting you back so soon. The judge is in his study, said he had letters to review. The housekeeper's tone suggested skepticism about this claim. Sarah, this is Miss Clara Bennett. She may be joining us as father's assistant. Miss Bennett, this is Sarah Miller, who has kept this household running smoothly since my mother passed away. Pleased to meet you, Mrs. Miller, Clara said, extending her hand. Sarah hesitated only momentarily before accepting it. Miss Bennett, any relation to Pastor Miller? No relation. I've just arrived from Boston. Understanding dawned in Sarah's eyes. You're the lady who was to marry Jeremiah Fowler today. Clara felt heat rising in her cheeks, but maintained her composure. That arrangement has been dissolved. Humph, Sarah responded with a wealth of meaning in the single syllable. Mr. Nathaniel, should I prepare tea in the study? Please, Sarah, and perhaps some of those shortbread cookies Father pretends not to favor. Nathaniel's warm smile transformed his serious features, revealing a hint of boyishness beneath his professional demeanor. Sarah nodded briskly and disappeared, leaving Clara and Nathaniel in the entrance hall. Now that the immediate crisis had passed, Clara felt awkwardness creeping in. She had just met this man, yet circumstances had thrust them into an unusual intimacy. Perhaps I should explain what happened today before meeting your father, Clara suggested quietly. I wouldn't want the judge to form misconceptions about my character. Nathaniel's expression softened. My father doesn't form opinions based on town gossip, Miss Bennett, but if it would make you more comfortable, we can speak privately first. He led her to a small sitting room adjacent to the main parlor. Unlike the more formal spaces, this room had the feel of daily use. A basket of mending beside one chair, a half-played chess game on a side table, newspapers stacked neatly on a desk by the window. My mother's morning room, Nathaniel explained, gesturing for Clara to take a seat. It gets the best light in winter. Clara settled into a comfortable armchair, smoothing her grey silk dress, the wedding dress that had never fulfilled its purpose. Mr. Montgomery, Nate, please, he interjected. Formality seems rather pointless after the circumstances of our meeting. Nate, she conceded, I want to be clear about what transpired with Mr. Fowler. We corresponded for 6 months before I agreed to travel west. I was entirely forthright about my appearance. She touched her scarred cheek lightly. He received a photograph taken before the fire, yes, but my letters described the extent of my injuries. Nate's expression darkened. Fowler likely assumed you were exaggerating for modesty's sake. He has a habit of hearing only what aligns with his interests. You're familiar with him? Unfortunately, my father has presided over several cases involving his business dealings. Nothing outright illegal, but Jeremiah Fowler operates in the gray areas of the law when it suits him. Nate leaned forward, his blue eyes intent. Miss Bennett, Clara, please understand that Fowler's behavior today reflects on his character, not yours. The kindness in his voice threatened to undo the careful composure Clara had maintained throughout her humiliation. She looked away, gathering herself before responding. I appreciate your saying so. Nevertheless, my situation remains complicated. I have limited funds, no connections here, and now a rather public stigma attached to my name. Which is why my offer is practical, rather than merely charitable, Nate replied. My father genuinely needs assistance. His eyesight is failing, though pride prevents him from admitting the extent of it. His hands shake too badly for consistent writing. Yet he insists on maintaining his correspondence and reviewing legal documents personally. Clara considered this information, and you believe I could assist with these tasks. Your letters to Fowler demonstrated excellent penmanship and articulation. Martha mentioned you managed your father's business affairs after his passing, suggesting familiarity with documents and accounts. Nate's pragmatic assessment was refreshingly free of pity. The arrangement would benefit both parties. Before Clara could respond, the door opened to admit an imposing figure that could only be Judge William Montgomery. Though he leaned heavily on a polished walnut cane, the judge carried himself with unbending dignity. His hair and beard were silver, contrasting sharply with the black suit and white shirt that seemed to be his uniform. Shrewd grey eyes, deeply set in a face mapped with experience, took in Clara's presence with undisguised curiosity. "I wasn't aware we were expecting company, Nathaniel," the judge said, his deep voice carrying the weight of authority without raising its volume. Nate rose immediately. "Father, may I present Miss Clara Bennett? Miss Bennett, my father, Judge William Montgomery." Clara stood, meeting the judge's assessing gaze directly. "It's an honor to meet you, Your Honor." "Miss Bennett arrived on today's stage from Boston," Nate explained. "She's well educated, experienced with business correspondence and seeking employment. I believe she might be the solution to your need for a personal assistant." The judge's bushy eyebrows rose slightly. "Is that so? And this urgent recruitment couldn't wait until I'd been consulted?" Clara recognized the tone of a man accustomed to control, though unlike Jeremiah Fowler's harsh dismissal, there was a sharpness of intellect behind the judge's questioning that invited response rather than silence. "Your son was kind enough to offer potential employment when my previous arrangements in Cedar Springs proved untenable," Clara said carefully. "If the timing is inconvenient, I completely understand." Now Judge Montgomery studied her face with the practiced scrutiny of someone who had spent decades evaluating truth in a courtroom. Unlike most, he neither flinched nor averted his gaze from her scars. "You were Fowler's mail-order bride," he stated, rather than asked. "Sarah mentioned the wedding was scheduled for today." Heat crept up Clara's neck. "Yes, sir. And I take it the ceremony didn't proceed as planned?" "No, sir." Clara lifted her chin. "Mr. Fowler found my appearance unacceptable upon meeting me in person, despite my having disclosed my injuries in our correspondence." The judge grunted. Typical Fowler. All business until human complexity intervenes. He moved to a wingback chair, lowering himself with the care of someone managing persistent pain. "Sit, both of you. Sarah's bringing tea, and I dislike having conversations with people hovering over me." As they settled, the judge fixed his gaze on Clara again. "Tell me, Miss Bennett, what led a Boston lady to consider marriage to a Colorado cattle rancher? The truth, if you please. I've heard enough polite fictions in my courtroom to last several lifetimes." Clara appreciated his directness. "Necessity, Your Honor. After my parents died, my prospects in Boston society were limited." She gestured to her scarred face with a matter-of-factness that belied the courage it took to acknowledge the reality so plainly. "I had sufficient education to work as a governess or companion, but my appearance frightened children and discomfited employers. When my funds began to dwindle, becoming a mail-order bride seemed a practical alternative to dependence on reluctant relatives." Judge Montgomery nodded thoughtfully. "And what did you tell Fowler about your situation?" "Everything relevant. I described the fire, my injuries, my education, my experience managing my father's accounts after his death. I sent a photograph taken before the fire, but made it abundantly clear that my appearance had been significantly altered." Clara met his gaze steadily. "I would not have traveled 2,000 miles on false pretenses, sir." "I believe you," the judge said simply. "Fowler, on the other hand, has selective hearing even in my courtroom. He likely convinced himself the situation was less severe than described." Sarah arrived with the tea tray, providing a momentary reprieve from the intensity of the judge's assessment. As she poured, Clara noted the older woman's efficient movements and the practiced way she prepared the judge's cup, Milk first, 1 sugar, stirred precisely 3 times before being placed on the table beside him. Once Sarah had withdrawn, Judge Montgomery returned his attention to Clara. "Nathaniel tells me you might solve our dilemma regarding my correspondence and legal documents. I would certainly be willing to try, sir. I have experience with business correspondence, basic accounting, and filing systems. My father was an attorney specializing in maritime law, so legal terminology isn't entirely foreign to me." The judge sipped his tea, his expression thoughtful. "And your expectations regarding compensation? Room, board, and a modest salary would be sufficient given my circumstances," Clara replied honestly. "More important to me would be clear boundaries regarding duties and hours, and the understanding that this arrangement would be professional rather than domestic service." A hint of amusement flickered in the judge's eyes. "You negotiate well, Miss Bennett. I begin to understand why Fowler found you disconcerting beyond the obvious." Nate leaned forward. "Father, Miss Bennett has had a difficult day. Perhaps we could—" "I'm not made of glass, Mr. Montgomery," Clara interjected gently but firmly. The judge's directness is refreshing after months of carefully worded letters that ultimately proved meaningless. Judge Montgomery's weathered face creased into an unexpected smile. "Well said, Miss Bennett. Attorneys and politicians spend their lives constructing facades of words that obscure rather than reveal truth. In my courtroom, I prefer clarity." He set down his teacup with a decisive click. "Here is my proposal. A 3-month trial period. Room and board in the East Wing, which has its own entrance and sitting area, $20 monthly salary, duties to include correspondence, document preparation, filing, and reading aloud when my eyes prove troublesome. Hours from 9 until 5 daily, with Sundays free." The offer was more generous than Clara had anticipated. "That seems very fair, Your Honor." "William, please, if we're to work together," the judge corrected. "I get enough of Your Honor in the courthouse." He reached for a shortbread cookie with a slightly trembling hand. "There will be gossip, of course. This town runs on little else." "I'm aware," Clara replied. "But I suspect the gossip was inevitable from the moment I stepped off the stagecoach." "Indeed." The judge studied her with newfound interest. "You've a pragmatic mind, Miss Bennett. I appreciate that." He turned to his son. "Nathaniel, would you ask Sarah to prepare the East Wing? Miss Bennett can move her belongings in tomorrow." "Tonight would be preferable, if it's not an imposition," Clara said. "I'd rather not return to the boarding house where I might encounter Mr. Fowler or his associates." Understanding passed across the judge's features. "Of course. Nathaniel, we'll arrange for your trunk to be collected." He rose laboriously from his chair, signaling the end of the interview. "We'll discuss specific duties tomorrow after you've settled in. For now, I suggest you rest. Journeys have a way of catching up with us when we least expect it." As he made his way toward the door, leaning heavily on his cane, the judge paused. "Miss Bennett, may I ask what you were reading on your journey west? Most ladies favor sentimental novels for such trips." The question surprised Clara. "Blackstone's Commentaries on the Laws of England, actually. It belonged to my father, and I thought it might provide insight into the legal foundation of the territories." Judge Montgomery's eyebrows rose appreciably. "Ambitious reading. We'll discuss your impressions tomorrow." With a nod that somehow conveyed both approval and dismissal, he departed, leaving Clara alone with Nathaniel once more. "Well?" Nate said with a hint of amazement. "I don't think I've seen my father take to someone so quickly since Professor Adams visited from Harvard last spring." "He's very direct," Clara observed. "A quality he values in others," Nate replied, smiling. "I believe you've passed some test he was administering without my knowledge." Clara felt the tension of the day beginning to ease. Does he often test people this way? Constantly. It's an occupational hazard of living with a judge. Nate stood. If you'll excuse me, I'll speak with Sarah about preparing your quarters and arrange to have your trunk brought from the boarding house. Left alone, Clara allowed herself a moment of wonder at the day's extraordinary turn of events. That morning, she had prepared to marry a stranger. By afternoon, she had endured public humiliation and rejection. Now, as evening approached, she found herself employed in the household of the most respected man in Cedar Springs, with private quarters and a salary that would allow her to maintain her independence. The emotional whiplash left her feeling untethered yet strangely hopeful. For the first time since the fire, someone had looked at her, truly looked at her, and seen beyond her scars to the person beneath. Two someones, in fact. When Nathaniel returned, Clara had composed herself once more. "Your belongings will be here within the hour," he informed her. "Would you like to see your quarters now?" Tutun. The East Wing proved to be a small suite, originally designed for visiting dignitaries. A sitting room with a writing desk and comfortable chair, a bedroom with a four-poster bed and walnut dresser, and a smaller room equipped with a porcelain wash basin and copper bathtub. "These were my mother's rooms toward the end of her illness," Nate explained, a shadow crossing his face. "She preferred the morning light, but found the main staircase difficult to navigate as her condition worsened." "I'm sorry for your loss," Clara said quietly. "It was 8 years ago. She never fully recovered from a fever she contracted while nursing me through pneumonia." His voice held old grief, weathered by time but never entirely absent. "Father commissioned this private entrance afterward so her friends could visit, without her having to exert herself meeting them in the formal parlor. The separate entrance was a stone arch opening onto a small garden, currently dormant but clearly well tended during growing seasons. It would allow Clara to come and go without passing through the main house, a consideration for both privacy and propriety. "It's more than I could have hoped for," she said sincerely. "Please thank your father again for his generosity." Nate's expression grew serious. "It's not charity, Clara. My father genuinely needs assistance, and finding someone suitable has been challenging. Most qualified individuals seek opportunities in Denver or even San Francisco. Those willing to remain in Cedar Springs often lack the necessary education or discretion, and don't bear the mark of public scandal," she added, with a wry smile. "You misunderstand me," Nate replied earnestly. "Your situation with Fowler makes you ideal, precisely because you have nothing to lose by maintaining your independence. A young, unmarried woman without your history might see this position as merely a stepping stone to marriage with an eligible local bachelor." The assessment was shrewd and not entirely comfortable. "While I'm damaged goods, unlikely to attract further proposals?" That's not," Nate began, then stopped, recognizing her gentle self-mockery. "You're teasing me." "Perhaps a little," Clara admitted. "You've been extraordinarily kind today, Mr. Montgomery. It seems only fair to lighten your burden of gallantry. Occasionally." His startled laugh revealed a different side to the serious young man who had rescued her from public humiliation. "I begin to think Jeremiah Fowler had a fortunate escape. You might have been more than he could manage." "A comforting thought," Clara replied, surprising herself with the realization that it was true. The sting of rejection remained, but beneath it lay a growing awareness that Jeremiah Fowler would have made a poor husband for a woman who valued her independence and intellect. When her trunk arrived, delivered by a tight-lipped Martha Wilson, who insisted on personally overseeing its placement in Clara's new quarters, the reality of her changed circumstances truly sank in. "That Fowler is a fool," Martha declared as she helped Clara unpack the modest collection of dresses and personal items, "though perhaps you've landed on your feet despite his best efforts." Her shrewd gaze took in the comfortable quarters. The Montgomerys are good people, principled, not always the easiest quality on the frontier, but reliable. I'm grateful for their intervention, Clara acknowledged. Just be careful, Martha advised. This town thrives on gossip, and a single woman living under the same roof as Nathaniel Montgomery will set tongues wagging, separate entrance or no. I'm employed by Judge Montgomery, not his son, Clara pointed out. Martha's expression suggested this distinction would matter little to local gossips. Judge may be respected, but he's old and ailing. It's Nathaniel who's the subject of every unmarried woman's speculation from here to Denver. She folded a shawl with practiced efficiency, handsome, educated, positioned to inherit both his father's reputation and property, and stubbornly single despite the best efforts of half the county's eligible daughters. Clara felt a flicker of unease. I have no romantic aspirations regarding Mr. Montgomery. My goal is simply to rebuild my life with dignity. I believe you, Martha replied, but what you believe and what others will say are rarely the same thing, especially in a town this size. She patted Clara's hand. Just be prepared, and know that my boarding house remains open to you should circumstances change. After Martha departed, Clara spent the evening settling into her new quarters, arranging her few books on the small shelf beside the writing desk, hanging dresses in the wardrobe, and finally changing into her nightgown. The events of the day had left her exhausted yet oddly alert, her mind racing with possibilities and concerns. She moved to the window, gazing out at the silhouette of mountains against the star-filled sky. Cedar Springs slept below, the town that had witnessed her humiliation and might yet be the setting for her redemption. Somewhere out there, Jeremiah Fowler had returned to his ranch, perhaps already composing a new advertisement for a bride without Clara's inconvenient scars. The thought no longer pained her as it might have hours earlier. Instead, she felt a curious lightness, as if she had narrowly escaped a trap disguised as opportunity. A soft knock at the door connecting her quarters to the main house startled her from her reverie. Hastily donning a wrapper over her nightgown, Clara opened it to find Sarah Miller holding a tray with a steaming cup. "Chamomile tea with honey," the housekeeper explained. "Judge's orders. Says no one sleeps well their first night in a strange place." "That's very thoughtful," Clara said, touched by the unexpected consideration. Sarah's expression softened slightly. "The judge is a good man, even if his manner can be abrupt. And Mr. Nathaniel—" She hesitated, then continued with careful neutrality. "Mr. Nathaniel looks for the best in people, always has, even as a boy." Clara recognized the gentle warning beneath the housekeeper's words. "I understand my position here, Mrs. Miller. I'm grateful for the opportunity, but have no intention of overstepping appropriate boundaries." Sarah studied her for a long moment before nodding. "Good night, Miss Bennett. Breakfast is served at 7. The judge takes his in the morning room. You're welcome to join him or to eat here if you prefer." "I'll join the judge," Clara decided. Best to establish working routines from the beginning. After Sarah departed, Clara sipped the fragrant tea and returned to the window. The Montgomery house stood on higher ground than most of Cedar Springs, affording a view of the small town stretching toward the river that had given it its name. In the moonlight, the frontier settlement looked almost picturesque, its rough edges softened by distance and shadow. Clara thought of the fire that had claimed her parents and marked her face, of the long journey west, filled with hope and trepidation, of Jeremiah Fowler's cold rejection and the unexpected kindness of strangers. So much had changed in a single day, yet the essential truth of her situation remained constant. She was alone in the world, responsible for forging her own path forward. The position with Judge Montgomery offered stability and purpose. If she performed well, it might lead to other opportunities, perhaps even recommendations that could open doors elsewhere should she choose to leave Cedar Springs eventually. For the first time since the fire, Clara allowed herself to contemplate a future shaped by her own choices rather than by the limitations imposed by her scars. It was a fragile hope, easily crushed by circumstance or prejudice, but it was hers to nurture. She slept soundly that night, dreamless and deep, awakening to the soft golden light of a Colorado sunrise filtering through her bedroom window. For a disorienting moment, she couldn't place herself. Not in her childhood home in Boston, nor in her aunt's spare bedroom, nor in Martha Wilson's boarding house. Then memory returned, the wedding that wasn't, Nathaniel Montgomery's intervention, Judge William Montgomery's unexpected offer, the east wing of the judge's home, her new position. Clara dressed carefully in a high-necked blue dress that she had intended to wear during her first week as Mrs. Fowler. The irony wasn't lost on her as she arranged her dark hair in a simple but neat style, ensuring that it didn't appear that she was attempting to hide her scars. The judge had looked directly at her disfigurement without flinching. She would offer him the same courtesy of straightforwardness. At precisely 7 o'clock, Clara made her way through the connecting door and into the main house. She found the morning room easily, guided by the aroma of coffee and the sound of a newspaper being folded. Judge Montgomery sat at a round table by the east-facing windows, already dressed in a somber black suit despite the early hour. The sunlight caught the silver in his hair and beard, lending him an almost patriarchal appearance, offset by the shrewd intelligence in his grey eyes. "Miss Bennett," he acknowledged, gesturing to the chair opposite his. "I trust you slept well." "Very well, thank you," Clara replied, taking the offered seat. "And thank you for the chamomile tea." It was a thoughtful gesture. "Sarah's suggestion, executed on my authority," the judge admitted with the hint of a smile, "an effective combination for most household matters." Sarah appeared as if summoned, carrying a tray with coffee, toast, and soft-boiled eggs. "Good morning, Miss Bennett." The judge takes his coffee black. "How do you prefer yours?" "A little milk, please," Clara answered, noting how the housekeeper's efficient movements suggested years of morning routines performed to perfection. Once they were served, and Sarah had withdrawn, the judge folded his newspaper and fixed Clara with his assessing gaze. "I believe in establishing clear expectations from the outset, Miss Bennett. It prevents misunderstandings later." "I appreciate directness," Clara replied, adding a small amount of milk to her coffee. "Good, then let me be plain. I am not an easy man to work for. My standards are exacting. I expect punctuality, thoroughness, and discretion in all matters." The judge broke the top of his egg with precise movements. "In return, I offer fair compensation, professional respect, and the understanding that your personal affairs remain your own unless they impact your duties. Those terms are entirely acceptable. Furthermore," the judge continued, "I recognize that your arrival in Cedar Springs and the circumstances of yesterday may subject you to unwelcome attention or gossip. While I cannot control what others say, I want you to know that under my roof, you will be treated with the respect due to your position." The simple dignity of this statement touched Clara unexpectedly. "Thank you, sir." "William," she corrected, remembering his preference from the previous day. "As for your duties," he continued, "they will primarily involve correspondence, document preparation, and filing. My role as territorial judge generates substantial paperwork. Cases in Denver, Silverton, and other settlements often require written opinions that must be precisely worded and properly filed." Clara nodded, mentally cataloguing the tasks. "Do you dictate your opinions, or would you prefer I draft them from your notes?" The question seemed to please him. "Initially, I'll dictate. However, if you demonstrate an aptitude for legal reasoning, we might progress to drafting from notes." He sipped his coffee. You mentioned your father was an attorney. Yes, specializing in maritime law. I often assisted him with research and correspondence, particularly in his final years when his health began to fail. And what did you observe about the law during that time? The judge asked, his tone casual but his gaze intent. Clara considered her response carefully, that it exists in the tension between fixed principles and human complexity, that its application requires both rigorous logic and compassionate understanding of circumstances. She paused, and that it is often most fallible when those who administer it are most certain of their infallibility. Judge Montgomery's bushy eyebrows rose appreciatively. Well said, Miss Bennett. Many attorneys twice your age haven't grasped that essential paradox. He returned to his breakfast. We'll begin at 9 in my study. Bring a notepad and pen. We'll start with routine correspondence before progressing to case materials. The conversation shifted to practical matters, where supplies were kept, which documents required formal letterhead, how the judge preferred his filing system maintained. Throughout, Clara was struck by William Montgomery's precise mind and clear expectations. Whatever his physical limitations, his intellect remained formidable. As they finished breakfast, Clara ventured a question of her own. If I may ask, what brought you to Cedar Springs? Your background suggests you could have practiced law in more established cities. The judge's expression grew reflective. I came west after the war between the states, as some still call it. I served as a military judge in the Union Army, saw too many young men from both sides destroyed by a conflict that reason should have prevented. He looked out the window toward the mountains. Afterward, established legal circles felt confining, too much precedent, too little room for building something truly just from first principles. So you chose the frontier. I chose a place where the law was still taking shape, yes. His gaze returned to her, sharp as ever. My wife, Catherine, supported the decision, though it meant leaving behind her family and social connections in Philadelphia. She believed, as I did, that justice might be more possible in a place not yet burdened by generations of entrenched power. Clara was struck by the idealism behind the judge's decision, a quality she hadn't initially perceived beneath his stern exterior. And has it proved true? Is justice more possible here? William Montgomery's weathered face creased, with a complexity of emotion that spoke to years of striving against human nature. Sometimes, when the people involved value fairness above advantage, when greed and fear don't cloud judgment. He set down his cup with finality. The work remains unfinished, Miss Bennett. Perhaps it always will. The philosophical turn of the conversation was interrupted by Nathaniel's arrival, already dressed in a tailored grey suit that marked him as clearly as his father's black attire, as someone whose work involved the professional classes rather than manual labor. Good morning, Father, Miss Bennett, he greeted them, helping himself to coffee. I trust you settled in comfortably. Very much so, Clara confirmed. Your father and I were just discussing my duties. Which reminds me, the judge interjected. Nathaniel, Miss Bennett will need access to the courthouse library occasionally for legal references. Can you arrange appropriate permissions? Of course, Nate agreed readily. I have a meeting with Sheriff Parker this morning regarding next week's circuit court session. I can speak with him about it then. As Clara observed the easy interaction between father and son, she noted both the similarities and differences. Between them, they shared the same tall build and strong features, but where the judge's manner was formal and reserved, Nathaniel possessed a natural warmth that softened his professional demeanor. Miss Bennett, would you allow me to show you around Cedar Springs properly this weekend? Nathaniel asked as he buttered a piece of toast. Yesterday's introduction was hardly representative of our community's better qualities. Clara hesitated, mindful of Martha's warnings about gossip. "That's very kind, but I wouldn't want to impose on your time." "It would be my pleasure," Nate insisted. "Besides, as my father's assistant, you should be familiar with the town's layout and key locations. The courthouse, the telegraph office, the newspaper, all places you may need to visit in the course of your duties." Put in those terms, the invitation seemed perfectly reasonable. "Then I would appreciate the orientation. Thank you." Judge Montgomery observed this exchange with an unreadable expression. "Excellent idea, Nathaniel. Miss Bennett should become acquainted with Cedar Springs beyond yesterday's unfortunate experience." He rose from the table with careful movements that betrayed his physical discomfort despite his dignified bearing. "Until 9 o'clock, Miss Bennett." As the judge departed, Clara found herself alone with Nathaniel. The morning sunlight illuminated his features, revealing flecks of gold in his blue eyes and the subtle signs of strain that suggested his responsibilities weighed heavily on him despite his capable manner. "Father seems impressed with you," he remarked, his tone suggesting mild surprise. "He's not given to quick judgments of character." "I appreciate his directness," Clara replied honestly. "After months of carefully worded correspondence with Mr. Fowler that ultimately proved meaningless, there's something refreshing about plain speaking." Nathaniel smiled, transforming his serious expression. "Then you and my father will get along famously. He has little patience for what he calls the embroidery of simple truth." He glanced at the clock on the mantel. "I should go. Sheriff Parker expects me at 8. "Of course," Clara said, suddenly aware that she had been staring at his smile longer than propriety allowed. "I have preparations to make before meeting your father at 9. As Nathaniel departed, Clara remained at the breakfast table momentarily, overwhelmed by the swift changes in her circumstances. 24 hours ago, she had been preparing to become Mrs. Jeremiah Fowler, steeling herself for the challenge of building a life with a stranger who knew her only through carefully composed letters. Now she sat in the morning room of the most respected man in Cedar Springs, employed as his assistant, with comfortable quarters, and the beginning of what might become respect based on her capabilities rather than pity for her disfigurement. For the first time since the fire that had claimed her parents and marked her face, Clara Bennett felt the stirring of genuine hope, not for marriage or conventional acceptance, but for the chance to build a life defined by her own choices rather than by others' reactions to her scars. She rose from the table, straightening her shoulders with newfound determination. 9 o'clock awaited, and with it the beginning of her new role in Judge William Montgomery's household, not as an object of charity or pity, but as a valued assistant with skills and intelligence to contribute. The prospect filled her with a quiet sense of purpose that had been absent for too long. The following weeks saw Clara settling into a routine at the Montgomery household. Each morning she joined the judge for breakfast in the morning room, discussing the day's tasks over coffee and toast. By 9 o'clock sharp, she was seated at the small desk in his study, pen poised to take dictation or prepare correspondence. Judge William Montgomery proved to be exactly as advertised, demanding, precise, and uncompromising in his standards. Yet Clara found herself thriving under his exacting expectations. Unlike her father, who had gently shielded her from the more complex aspects of his legal practice, the judge assigned her increasingly substantive work as she demonstrated her capabilities. "Your penmanship is excellent," he remarked one afternoon as she completed a formal opinion for a land dispute case. "And more importantly, you capture the nuances of legal reasoning without unnecessary embellishment." "Thank you," Clara replied, carefully blotting the ink before setting the document aside to dry. "I find the work fascinating. The balance between competing legitimate claims requires such careful consideration." The judge leaned back in his leather chair, studying her with those perceptive grey eyes that seemed to evaluate everything they beheld. Most would find water rights disputes between ranchers tedious rather than fascinating. Perhaps, Clara acknowledged with a small smile, but the underlying principles matter enormously to the parties involved. Their livelihoods depend on these decisions. Something like approval flickered across the judge's weathered features. Indeed. Too many in the legal profession forget that abstractions on paper translate to tangible consequences for real people. He tapped his fingers thoughtfully on the arm of his chair. Tomorrow, I'd like you to accompany me to the courthouse. It's time you observed proceedings firsthand, rather than merely processing the resulting paperwork. Clara felt a flutter of both anxiety and anticipation. Venturing to the courthouse would mean facing the wider community of Cedar Springs for the first time since her public humiliation at the church. Despite the professional respect she'd found within the Montgomery household, she harbored no illusions about how the town viewed her. "Of course," she replied, keeping her voice steady. "What time should I be ready?" 9:30, court begins at 10. The judge's expression suggested he understood her unspoken concerns. "You'll enter through my private chambers. No need to navigate the public gallery." His consideration touched her. "Thank you, but that won't be necessary. I prefer to face things directly." Judge Montgomery studied her for a long moment before nodding. "As you wish. Though you should know that Cedar Springs has largely moved on to fresher gossip. A traveling medicine show arrived last week, and the proprietor was caught selling colored water as miracle elixir. The scandal has quite overshadowed your arrival." The dry humor in his tone startled a laugh from Clara. "How fortunate for me, though I feel for those who purchased the elixir." Sheriff Parker ensured refunds were provided before escorting the charlatan to the town limits. The judge shifted in his chair, a flicker of discomfort crossing his face as he adjusted his position to ease what Clara had come to recognize as persistent pain in his back and legs. "That will be all for today, Miss Bennett. I suggest you review the Watkins boundary dispute file before tomorrow's session." Clara gathered her materials, recognizing the judge's need for rest, though he would never request it directly. In the 3 weeks since she had joined his household, she had learned to read the signs of his fatigue, the slight tremor in his hands becoming more pronounced, the tightness around his eyes deepening, the careful way he measured his movements. "I'll have Sarah bring your tea," she said, a statement rather than a question. It had become their unspoken routine. Clara would withdraw when the judge's strength began to wane, and Sarah would appear with a tea service that included the willow bark infusion Dr. Green had prescribed for pain. "Thank you, Miss Bennett." The formal address had remained, despite their daily proximity. Clara found she appreciated the professional boundary it maintained, reinforcing her position as an employee rather than a charity case. As she left the study, Clara encountered Sarah in the hallway, already preparing the judge's tea tray. The housekeeper had gradually warmed to her over the past weeks, moving from polite reserve to cautious acceptance as Clara proved herself both capable and discreet. "He's having a difficult day," Clara murmured, keeping her voice low. "The barometer's falling." Sarah nodded, unsurprised. "His leg always troubles him more before a storm. I've added extra willow bark to the blend." She hesitated, then added, "You're good with him. Know when to push and when to withdraw. Not many manage that balance." "Didn't do," and the simple acknowledgement meant more to Clara than elaborate praise might have. "He makes it easy by being unfailingly honest about his expectations, if not always about his limitations." A rare smile softened Sarah's practical features. "The Montgomery men have that in common, honesty to a fault, and stubbornness about admitting weakness." She lifted the tray. Mr. Nathaniel asked me to tell you he'll be returning late this evening. Some legal matter in Silverton required his attention. Clara nodded, ignoring the small pang of disappointment. Over the past weeks, she'd grown accustomed to evening conversations with Nathaniel in the library after the judge retired. What had begun as polite inquiry about her adjustment to the household had evolved into wide-ranging discussions of books, territorial politics, and legal principles. Nathaniel possessed his father's sharp intellect, but tempered it with a warmth and consideration the judge either lacked or had learned to conceal beneath his judicial demeanor. He treated Clara's opinions with genuine interest, challenging her viewpoints without dismissing them, introducing her to ideas and authors she hadn't encountered in her father's more traditional library. These evening discussions had become a bright point in Clara's days, though she was careful to maintain appropriate boundaries. Martha Wilson's warnings about local gossip remained fresh in her mind, and she had no intention of complicating her position in the Montgomery household by fostering rumors about her relationship with the judge's son. Returning to her quarters, in the East Wing, Clara retrieved the Watkins boundary dispute file from her desk and settled into the comfortable chair by the window. The case involved contested property lines between two ranching families, complicated by a creek that had changed course during spring flooding several years earlier. As she reviewed the surveys, affidavits, and previous correspondence, Clara found herself absorbed in the technical details and human drama intertwined in the dispute. Judge Montgomery approached such cases with a combination of strict legal reasoning and practical understanding of frontier realities that Clara found increasingly compelling. The afternoon light was fading when a knock at her private entrance interrupted her concentration. Puzzled, few people knew of the separate access to her quarters. Clara set aside the file and moved to open the door. Martha Wilson stood on the small porch, her usually composed features tight with concern. "Forgive the intrusion, but I thought you should know. Jeremiah Fowler is in town, drinking heavily at the Golden Nugget. He's been speaking unkindly about you." Clara felt a chill despite the warm spring afternoon. "I see. Thank you for warning me." He claims you misrepresented yourself deliberately," Martha continued, her voice low as if she feared being overheard even here. "Says you trapped him into bringing you west under false pretenses." "That's absurd," Clara replied, indignation flaring. "I was entirely truthful in my letters." "Truth matters little when a man's pride is wounded," Martha said grimly, "especially when that pride is being marinated in whiskey. I thought you should be aware, should you venture into town." Clara straightened her shoulders. "I'm accompanying Judge Montgomery to court tomorrow morning." Martha's expression tightened further. "Perhaps you should reconsider, at least until Fowler leaves town, and have him believe I'm hiding from him." "No!" Clara's resolve hardened. "I've done nothing wrong, Martha. I won't skulk about as if I had." The older woman sighed. "I expected as much. You're not one to take the easier path, are you?" She reached into her pocket and withdrew a small object. "Here, I want you to carry this." Clara looked down at the Derringer pistol Martha had pressed into her hand, its polished wooden grip gleaming against the small steel barrel. "Martha, I can't." "You can, and you will," Martha interrupted firmly. "I've lived on the frontier long enough to know that principles don't stop a man who's deep in his cups and fixed on vengeance. It's loaded. Keep it in your pocket tomorrow." The weight of the small weapon felt foreign in Clara's hand. She had never handled a firearm before, though she had watched her father clean his dueling pistols on occasion. "I wouldn't know how to use it properly." "Point and pull the trigger," Martha said bluntly, "though with luck, simply knowing you have it will give you confidence, and you'll never need to produce it." She glanced toward the main house. I should go before my absence from the boarding house is noted. Be careful, Clara." After Martha departed, Clara stood at the window watching the first stars appear above the mountains, the small pistol heavy in her palm. The prospect of facing Jeremiah Fowler again sent unease curling through her stomach, not from fear of the man himself, but from the public confrontation that might ensue. She had worked diligently to establish herself as the judge's capable assistant, earning grudging respect from the courthouse clerks and attorneys, who initially viewed her with suspicion and curiosity. A public altercation with Fowler could undermine that carefully cultivated professional reputation. Yet Martha was right. Clara was not one to take the easier path. She had traveled 2,000 miles seeking a fresh start, endured public humiliation, and forged a new place for herself through competence and determination. She would not now allow Jeremiah Fowler's wounded pride to dictate her movements or choices. With careful movements, Clara stored the derringer in her desk drawer, resolving to carry it tomorrow as Martha had insisted, while hoping circumstances would never require its use. Then she returned to the Watkins file, forcing her attention back to the legal details that would be discussed in court the following morning. When Sarah called her to dinner, Clara found the judge alone at the dining table, Nathaniel's absence a reminder of his business in Silverton. The evening meal passed with comfortable conversation about the upcoming court session, the judge quizzing Clara on the details of the boundary dispute and nodding with approval at her thorough understanding of the case. "You have a natural aptitude for legal reasoning," he remarked as they finished their apple tart dessert. "You identify the essential points of contention without becoming lost in extraneous details." "My father used to say that the law is like mathematics," Clara replied. "One must identify the correct formula to apply to the specific problem at hand." The judge considered this analogy. Not inaccurate, though I would add that unlike mathematics, the human element introduces variables that seldom conform to neat equations. Hence the need for judgment beyond mere formula, Clara agreed. The discretion that makes a good judge more than simply a human calculating machine. A rare smile creased William Montgomery's stern features. "Well put, Miss Bennett. It's precisely that balance between principle and practicality that makes the law endlessly challenging." He set down his napkin, signaling the end of the meal. "I'll retire early this evening. Tomorrow's session may be lengthy, and these days I find I need more rest than I care to admit. Of course, I'll see you at breakfast." Alone in her quarters once more, Clara prepared for the following day with methodical care, selecting a high-necked navy dress that struck the right balance between professional dignity and modest restraint. She arranged the documents for the boundary dispute in a leather portfolio, ensuring all necessary maps and surveys were included. Finally, with a moment's hesitation, she retrieved Martha's derringer from the desk drawer and examined it in the lamplight. The small weapon seemed incongruous in her hands more accustomed to wielding pens and arranging papers than handling firearms. After a moment's consideration, she wrapped it in a handkerchief and placed it in her reticule, where it could be accessed if needed, but remained discreetly out of sight. Morning brought clear skies and the promise of warming temperatures, belying Sarah's prediction of approaching storms. Clara joined the judge for breakfast at 7, noting that his movements seemed less pained than the previous day. "Sheriff Parker reports that the Watkins and Garrett families have both arrived in town," the judge remarked as he buttered his toast. "Both parties seem committed to resolving the dispute, which should simplify matters." "That's encouraging," Clara replied, though her thoughts were partially occupied by Martha's warning about Jeremiah Fowler. "Will Mr. Montgomery be attending the proceedings?" Nathaniel sent word that his business in Silverton is concluded. He should return by mid-morning and will likely join us at the courthouse. The judge studied her over his coffee cup. "You seem preoccupied, Miss Bennett. Is something troubling you?" Clara hesitated, uncertain whether to mention Fowler's presence in town. The judge valued forthright communication, yet she was reluctant to appear as if she was seeking special protection. "It's nothing significant," she said finally. "Simply anticipation about my first court session." Judge Montgomery's penetrating gaze suggested he sensed her partial evasion, but chose not to press further. "You'll find the proceedings less formal than Eastern courts. Frontier justice requires certain adaptations to circumstance while maintaining essential principles." At 9:15, they departed for the courthouse, the judge walking with measured dignity despite his reliance on the polished walnut cane. The two-story stone building stood at the center of Cedar Springs, its classical facade and columned entrance suggesting permanence and authority in a town still composed primarily of wooden structures. Clara was acutely aware of glances from townspeople as they made their way up the courthouse steps, but the reaction seemed more curious than hostile. Many touched their hats or nodded respectfully to the judge, their gazes sliding to Clara with interest but without the open judgment she had feared. Inside, the courthouse bustled with activity. Clerks sorting papers, attorneys conferring with clients, witnesses waiting nervously on wooden benches. The main courtroom occupied most of the first floor, with high windows allowing natural light to illuminate the judge's raised bench, jury box, and public gallery. Judge Montgomery led Clara to his private chambers, a wood-paneled room behind the courtroom containing a substantial desk, law books lining the walls, and a smaller table where attorneys could confer with the judge on procedural matters. "You'll sit at the clerk's table to the right of the bench," he instructed, removing his overcoat and donning the black judicial robe Sarah had carefully pressed the previous evening. "From there, you can observe proceedings while remaining accessible should I require specific documents or assistance." Clara nodded, arranging the Watkins Garrett file on the clerk's table before taking her place as the courtroom began to fill. The litigating families entered separately, the Watkins clan, headed by a weather-beaten rancher with 3 similarly weathered sons, and the Garretts, a younger couple accompanied by an elderly man Clara assumed was a parent or uncle. As the room settled, Sheriff Thomas Parker called for attention, his imposing figure and star-shaped badge commanding immediate respect. "All rise for the Honorable Judge William Montgomery, Territorial Court of Colorado." The judge entered from his chambers, his measured pace and stern countenance embodying the dignity of his office despite his physical limitations. As he took his seat at the bench, his gaze swept the courtroom with practiced authority. "Be seated," he commanded, his deep voice carrying easily to the furthest corners of the room. "This court is now in session." The proceedings began with the Watkins-Garrett boundary dispute. Clara listened attentively as attorneys for both parties presented their arguments, referring occasionally to the documents before her to verify specific claims. Judge Montgomery conducted the session with firm efficiency, allowing each side to present its case while preventing digressions into personal grievances that clearly simmered beneath the legal arguments. Clara was so absorbed in the proceedings that she almost missed the late arrival that caused a stir near the back of the courtroom. A glance over her shoulder confirmed her worst fears. Jeremiah Fowler had entered, his broad figure unmistakable. Even at a distance, his expression dark beneath his hat brim. Returning her attention firmly to the case at hand, Clara focused on maintaining her professional composure. She would not give Fowler the satisfaction of seeing her discomfited by his presence. The boundary dispute concluded before noon, with Judge Montgomery delivering a nuanced ruling that established a compromise boundary line while securing water access for both properties. Neither family appeared entirely satisfied, yet neither could claim to have been disadvantaged, the hallmark of effective judicial compromise. As the court clerk announced a brief recess before the next case, Clara became aware of movement in her peripheral vision. Jeremiah Fowler had made his way to the front of the courtroom and now stood before the clerk's table, his stance deliberately intimidating. "Well, if it isn't the deceptive bride herself," he said, his voice carrying clearly. "In the momentarily hushed courtroom, playing at being a legal secretary now, found someone willing to overlook your flaws?" Clara's hand instinctively moved toward her reticule before she caught herself. Instead, she met his gaze with composed dignity. "Mr. Fowler, court is in recess, but this remains a place of law. I suggest you conduct yourself accordingly." Fowler's face darkened. "Don't you lecture me about propriety, woman. Not after trying to trap me into marriage under false pretenses." "That's quite enough, Fowler." Judge Montgomery's authoritative voice cut through the tension. He had not left the bench during the recess, and now fixed Jeremiah with a stern glare. "You will not disrupt my courtroom with personal grievances." "With respect, Your Honor," Fowler replied, his tone suggesting anything but respect. "This matter concerns public fraud. This woman, Miss Bennett, is an employee of this court," the judge interrupted sharply. "Any complaint you wish to register about her conduct should be presented through proper legal channels, not through disruptive behavior in my courtroom." Fowler's hands clenched at his sides. "She's made a fool of me in this town." "You seem perfectly capable of accomplishing that without assistance," came a cool voice from the side entrance. Nathaniel Montgomery had arrived, still dressed in his traveling clothes, his expression coldly furious as he assessed the situation. "Sheriff Parker, I believe Mr. Fowler is disturbing court proceedings." Sheriff Parker moved forward with obvious reluctance. Though charged with maintaining order, the lawman clearly had no desire to antagonize one of the region's wealthy ranchers without absolute necessity. "Now, Mr. Fowler, let's not have trouble," he began placatingly. "Why don't you step outside and cool down a bit?" Jeremiah's gaze shifted between Nathaniel, the judge, and Clara, who maintained her composed exterior despite the rapid beating of her heart. For a tense moment, she thought he might escalate the confrontation further. Instead, he spat on the courtroom floor, a deliberate show of contempt. "This isn't finished," he muttered, loud enough for Clara to hear, though perhaps not for others. Then he turned and stalked from the courtroom, shouldering roughly past Sheriff Parker. The incident had attracted the attention of everyone present, generating a wave of whispers that rippled through the gallery. Clara felt heat rising in her cheeks but kept her expression neutral as she reorganized the documents before her, refusing to acknowledge the curious stares. Judge Montgomery rapped his gavel once, commanding silence. "Court will resume in 15 minutes. Sheriff Parker, ensure that Mr. Fowler does not return to these proceedings." As the courtroom settled once more, Nathaniel approached the clerk's table, his concerned gaze meeting Clara's. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly. "Perfectly fine," she replied with more confidence than she felt. "Mr. Fowler's behavior reflects on him, not me." Nathaniel's expression softened with something like admiration. "Most would be shaken by such a public confrontation." Perhaps I've had sufficient practice with public scenes to develop immunity," Clara said wryly, referring to her ill-fated wedding. "Though I admit I'm grateful for your timely arrival." "Fortuitous timing," he agreed, though something in his expression suggested it might not have been entirely coincidental. "I received word about Fowler's presence in town and his statements regarding you." Clara glanced toward the judge, who was reviewing notes for the next case with deliberate concentration that might have been genuine or might have been a courtesy to allow them their quiet conversation. "News travels quickly in Cedar Springs," she observed. "A mixed blessing," Nathaniel replied. "In this instance, it allowed me to expedite my return from Silverton." He hesitated, then added more softly, "Be cautious, Clara. Fowler has influential friends and a reputation for holding grudges." The use of her given name, rare in their public interactions, emphasized his concern. "I can handle Jeremiah Fowler," she assured him, though Martha's derringer weighed heavily in her reticule. "I don't doubt it," Nathaniel said with a brief smile. "Nevertheless, I'll accompany you and Father home after court concludes." The remainder of the court session proceeded without further incident, though Clara remained conscious of curious glances from the gallery. By 3 o'clock, Judge Montgomery had heard all scheduled cases and adjourned court until the following week. The journey home was undertaken in thoughtful silence, the judge walking between Clara and Nathaniel as if to physically emphasize her position under his protection. Only when they reached the safety of the Montgomery residence did the judge address the courthouse confrontation. "Say, Fowler's behavior was unacceptable," he stated flatly as Sarah helped him remove his judicial robe. "I've instructed Sheriff Parker to issue a warning. Any further harassment will result in legal consequences." "That may simply inflame the situation," Clara suggested. "Mr. Fowler clearly feels his pride was injured. Official censure might deepen his resentment." "Perhaps," the judge acknowledged, "but principles must be maintained, regardless of wounded pride or potential complications." He fixed Clara with his penetrating gaze. "You conducted yourself with admirable composure, Miss Bennett. Lesser individuals might have responded to provocation with equal incivility. Coming from Judge Montgomery, this was high praise indeed." "Thank you, sir. I value your good opinion." As you should," he replied with unexpected warmth. "It is not given lightly nor without cause." With that, he excused himself to rest before dinner, leaving Clara and Nathaniel alone in the entrance hall. "He's impressed with you," Nathaniel observed once the judge had departed. "I can count on one hand the number of people who have earned his unqualified approval." Hardly unqualified," Clara demurred. "Your father maintains appropriately high standards for everyone in his orbit." "Indeed, which makes his assessment all the more meaningful." Nathaniel's expression grew serious. "About Fowler, I'd rather not discuss him further," Clara interrupted gently. "He's occupied quite enough of my thoughts today." "Of course," Nathaniel nodded, respecting her wish to change the subject. "Then perhaps you'd join me in the library. I found a volume in Silverton that might interest you, a collection of territorial legal precedents compiled by Judge Harrison." The prospect of their usual literary discussion offered welcome normality after the day's tensions. "I'd like that very much," Clara replied. "Let me arrange these documents in your father's study, and I'll join you shortly." In the judge's study, Clara carefully filed the day's court documents, her mind reviewing the confrontation with Jeremiah Fowler. While she had maintained her composure in the moment, she harbored no illusions that the matter was resolved. Fowler's parting words, "This isn't finished," suggested a threat rather than mere bluster. The small derringer remained in her reticule, a tangible reminder of frontier realities that her Boston upbringing had not prepared her to face. Clara had always prided herself on self-sufficiency, on finding solutions through intellect and determination, rather than force. Yet Martha's insistence on practical protection now seemed prescient rather than paranoid. As she completed her filing, Clara resolved to remain vigilant without allowing fear to circumscribe her movements or activities. She would continue her duties, maintain her dignity, and trust that the respect she had earned within the Montgomery household would eventually extend to the wider community of Cedar Springs. With this determination firmly in mind, she joined Nathaniel in the library, where the promised legal volume lay open on the reading table, awaiting her curious examination. The familiar comfort of books and ideas offered temporary sanctuary from frontier conflicts and wounded pride, a reminder that the life of the mind remained available to her regardless of external circumstances. "I thought you might appreciate Judge Harrison's commentary on water rights," Nathaniel said, drawing her attention to a particular passage. "His approach differs somewhat from my father's, emphasizing communal benefit over strict property boundaries." As they settled into their discussion, the courthouse confrontation receded into proper perspective, an unpleasant incident rather than a defining moment. Clara found herself relaxing into the familiar pattern of intellectual exchange that had become one of her greatest pleasures in the Montgomery household. Yet beneath this apparent return to normalcy, a watchfulness remained, an awareness that Jeremiah Fowler's wounded pride might yet demand a price she was unwilling to pay. The following week brought an unseasonable heat wave to Cedar Springs, the June sun beating down on the town with an intensity that left boardwalks too hot to touch by midday and sent citizens seeking shade wherever it could be found. Inside the Montgomery house, windows remained open, despite the dust that inevitably settled on furniture and papers, the slight breeze offering minimal relief from the oppressive temperature. Clara had taken to rising before dawn to complete her most demanding tasks in the relative cool of early morning. By the time Judge Montgomery joined her for breakfast, she had often already prepared correspondence or organized case files for his review, maximizing productivity before the heat made concentration difficult. "You're becoming indispensable," the judge remarked one morning as he reviewed her neatly transcribed notes on a complex inheritance dispute. "These annotations identify precisely the precedents I was considering. I'm beginning to anticipate your legal reasoning," Clara acknowledged, pouring his coffee, "though I fear I'm still more useful as a secretary than a legal mind." Judge Montgomery made a dismissive gesture with his hand. "Don't underestimate yourself, Miss Bennett. Many who've studied law formally show less aptitude for its application than you demonstrate daily." He took a sip of coffee before adding, "Nathaniel mentioned you've been reading Blackstone's commentaries in the evenings." Clara felt a flush that had nothing to do with the heat. Her evening discussions with Nathaniel had indeed turned increasingly toward legal topics, with him guiding her through foundational texts from the judge's extensive library. That the judge knew of these sessions wasn't surprising. The Montgomery men shared a close relationship despite their formal manners, but his bringing it up directly suggested he had formed some opinion on the matter. "Mr. Montgomery has been unkind enough to explain certain principles I find challenging," she said carefully. "Your library is remarkably comprehensive. Catherine, my late wife, believed in the importance of books, particularly on the frontier." A shadow of old grief crossed his weathered features. She used to say, "Civilization travels in the form of bound pages long before it arrives in architecture or institutions." She sounds like a remarkable woman. She was. The judge's expression softened momentarily before returning to its usual judicial reserve. "Which brings me to a matter I've been considering. The territorial bar examination is scheduled for September in Denver. I believe you should prepare to take it." Clara nearly dropped her teacup. "Sir, you have the intellect, the dedication, and increasingly, the knowledge. What you lack in formal education could be overcome with focused study over the next 3 months." He regarded her steadily. "The territory has no prohibition against women practicing law, though tradition and prejudice create practical barriers." The suggestion was so unexpected that Clara found herself temporarily speechless. Women attorneys were rare even in the East, where access to formal legal education remained severely limited. On the frontier, she knew of none. I'm honored by your confidence," she managed finally, "but surely the examination requires credentials I don't possess." "Ordinarily, yes. However, as Chief Justice of the Territorial Court, I have certain discretionary powers regarding candidates. The judge's expression remained impassive, but his eyes held a hint of the same idealism that had brought him west years earlier. The law should be accessible to all with the capacity to uphold its principles, regardless of conventional qualifications. Clara's mind raced with implications. Even if I could pass the examination, which seems unlikely given my limited preparation, what practical purpose would it serve? No law office would employ a woman attorney, particularly one with, she gestured to her scarred face, additional disadvantages. Perhaps not immediately, Judge Montgomery conceded, but legal certification would allow you to handle certain matters independently. Wills, property transactions, basic contracts. Many in the territory lack access to legal services entirely. You might build a practice gradually among those overlooked by established attorneys. The possibility he described sent a thrill of potential through her. Not just employment, but a profession. Not merely independence, but purpose. Yet practicality tempered her response. The community's reaction would be challenging. Judge, Montgomery's expression hardened slightly. Undoubtedly, progress rarely arrives without resistance, Miss Bennett. The question is whether you're willing to face that resistance in pursuit of a worthy goal. Before Clara could respond, Sarah appeared in the doorway, her normally composed features tense. Judge, Mr. Nathaniel asked me to inform you that there's a situation at the courthouse requiring your immediate attention. Something in Sarah's tone suggested more than routine court business. Judge Montgomery rose immediately, reaching for his cane. What sort of situation? Sheriff Parker has Jeremiah Fowler in custody, Sarah replied, her gaze flickering briefly to Clara. There was an incident at the newspaper office this morning. Mr. Nathaniel thought you should be informed privately before it becomes public knowledge. Clara felt a cold knot form in her stomach despite the day's heat. She had deliberately avoided town since the confrontation in the courtroom, focusing on her duties at the judge's home while allowing time for gossip to subside. That Fowler had created some new incident related to her seemed all too likely. I see. The judge's expression revealed nothing of his thoughts. Miss Bennett, we'll continue our discussion regarding the bar examination later. For now, I believe we both have duties requiring attention. Clara recognized the dismissal for what it was, an attempt to shield her from whatever unpleasantness Fowler had initiated. But she had learned enough of frontier directness to prefer uncomfortable truths to protective omissions. Sir, if this matter concerns me, I would prefer to know its nature. Judge Montgomery studied her for a moment before nodding. A reasonable request. Sarah, what precisely occurred? The housekeeper's mouth tightened into a thin line. According to Mr. Nathaniel, Mr. Fowler attempted to have an unflattering account of Miss Bennett published in the Cedar Springs Gazette. When Mr. Harrison refused to print it without verification, Mr. Fowler became violent. Sheriff Parker was summoned. Humiliation burned through Clara, followed quickly by anger. What sort of account? Sarah's discomfort was evident. I don't know the specifics, miss, only that Mr. Nathaniel described it as libelous fabrication. Jeremiah, Fowler's spite ran deeper than Clara had anticipated. Not content with publicly rejecting her, he now sought to destroy whatever reputation she had managed to build in Cedar Springs through deliberate defamation. Thank you for your honesty, Sarah. Clara turned to the judge, straightening her shoulders. Sir, I would like to accompany you to the courthouse. If I am to be the subject of public discussion, I prefer to face it directly rather than hide from it. Judge Montgomery's bushy eyebrows rose slightly, but approval flickered in his gray eyes. As you wish, Miss Bennett, though I advise you to prepare yourself for unpleasantness. Fowler's accusations, while almost certainly false, may be of a delicate nature. I understand. Clara was already mentally armoring herself against whatever new humiliation awaited. I'll fetch my hat. The walk to the courthouse seemed longer than usual in the oppressive heat. The town, unusually quiet as most residents, sought indoor shelter from the punishing sun. Judge Montgomery maintained a dignified pace, despite the discomfort evident in his careful movements. His formal black attire impractical, but unwavering regardless of weather. They entered through the judge's private entrance, bypassing the curious onlookers already gathering in the main corridor despite the early hour. News traveled with remarkable speed in Cedar Springs, particularly when it involved conflict between prominent figures. In the judge's chambers, they found Nathaniel in intense conversation with Sheriff Parker, both men turning as the door opened. Nathaniel's expression shifted from tension to concern when he saw Clara. "Clara, Miss Bennett, I didn't expect you to accompany my father." Miss Bennett prefers to confront matters directly," Judge Montgomery explained, lowering himself carefully into his chair. "A quality I find commendable, if occasionally imprudent." Sheriff Parker removed his hat, revealing sweat-dampened hair plastered to his forehead. "Judge, this is an unfortunate business. Fowler's in the holding cell cooling off, but he's demanding Harrison print his statement or he'll distribute it himself throughout town." "And the nature of this statement?" the judge inquired, his judicial demeanor firmly in place. The sheriff's uncomfortable glance toward Clara spoke volumes. "It contains allegations about Miss Bennett's character and past that are unsuitable for mixed company." "I am not a delicate flower requiring protection from harsh language, Sheriff," Clara said calmly, despite the renewed flush of anger warming her cheeks. "Please speak plainly," Nathaniel intervened, his voice tight with controlled fury. "Fowler has constructed a fiction painting you as a woman of loose morals who deliberately concealed not just your scarring, but a scandalous past in Boston. He claims to have received correspondence from acquaintances there, confirming his allegations. The absurdity of the accusation might have been laughable if it weren't so deliberately calculated to destroy her standing in the community. Clara had lived a life of rigid propriety even before the fire, and afterward had withdrawn from society almost entirely until her journey west. "I see," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "And Mr. Harrison refused to print these fabrications?" "Edward Harrison is a responsible journalist," Sheriff Parker confirmed. "He insisted on verification before publishing such serious allegations against someone connected to the judge's household." Fowler took exception to this professional caution. "Violently," Nathaniel added grimly. "Harrison has a split lip and broken spectacles to show for his editorial principles." Judge Montgomery's expression hardened. "Assault is a criminal offense, Sheriff. I trust Mr. Fowler has been formally charged." "Yes, sir, though he's already sent for his attorney." The sheriff shifted uncomfortably. "Lawrence Preston arrived about 20 minutes ago and is demanding Fowler's immediate release. Claims Harrison provoked the incident." The judge's scowl deepened at the mention of Preston, a name Clara recognized from courthouse conversations as belonging to a Denver attorney known for representing wealthy clients regardless of the ethical implications. "Preston has no standing in my court without proper notification," Judge Montgomery stated flatly. "Fowler will remain in custody until a hearing can be arranged tomorrow morning." Nathaniel cleared his throat. "Father, there's another matter to consider. Fowler claims to have written copies of his statement ready for distribution. If he makes bail, there's nothing legally preventing him from circulating these libelous materials throughout town. The damage would be done before any legal remedy could be applied," Clara observed quietly, the reality of her vulnerability settling like a weight in her stomach. The frontier justice system, with its emphasis on personal liberty and minimal government interference, offered little protection against the character assassination Fowler seemed determined to pursue. Judge Montgomery tapped his fingers thoughtfully on his desk. "Sheriff, what is your assessment of Fowler's current state? Is he likely to pursue this vindictive course once he's had time to reconsider?" Sheriff Parker's weathered face creased with concern. "Hard to say, Judge. He's been drinking heavily since he came to town 3 days ago. But there's a calculation behind it, too. This isn't just alcohol talking. He means to hurt Miss Bennett's reputation permanently." "Because I wounded his pride," Clara said, the pieces falling into place. "His standing in the community was damaged when I rejected him, as he sees it. Now he intends to ensure I have no place here either." "A petty, vindictive motivation," the judge observed coldly, "but not an uncommon one. The question remains how best to address it." A tense silence fell over the chamber as each considered the limited options available. Clara was acutely aware that her precarious position in Cedar Springs, still a newcomer, marked both by her scars and the failed wedding, made her particularly vulnerable to malicious gossip. Even unfounded accusations could permanently damage her standing in the community. "There is one approach we haven't considered," Nathaniel said slowly, his expression unreadable as he turned to face Clara directly. "A course that would render Fowler's accusations not just false, but irrelevant." "What are you suggesting?" she asked, puzzled by his suddenly formal manner. Nathaniel straightened his shoulders, as if preparing to step before a jury. "Marriage, Miss Bennett. If you were to become my wife, Fowler's attacks on your character would reflect poorly on him rather than damaging you. Few in Cedar Springs would credit malicious gossip about the wife of Judge Montgomery's son, particularly when the source is a man with obvious motives for vengeance." Clara stared at him, momentarily speechless at the unexpected proposal delivered in such practical terms, more a legal strategy than a romantic overture. "Nathaniel," Judge Montgomery interjected, his tone sharp with surprise, "this is hardly the appropriate circumstance for such a proposition." "On the contrary, Father, the timing is precisely what makes it effective," Nathaniel countered, his legal mind clearly assessing all angles of the situation. "A swift marriage before Fowler can distribute his libelous materials would undercut his entire strategy. My position in the community would effectively shield Miss Bennett from the worst impacts of his vindictiveness." Clara found her voice at last. "Mr. Montgomery, while I appreciate your tactical thinking, marriage is rather an extreme solution to what is essentially a temporary problem." "Is it temporary, though?" Nathaniel challenged gently. "Fowler has demonstrated his willingness to pursue this vendetta beyond reasonable limits. Even if this particular attempt fails, his resentment seems unlikely to fade." Sheriff Parker cleared his throat awkwardly. "If I might speak plainly, a wedding would certainly redirect town gossip. Folks are always more interested in a romance than a scandal, especially one involving the judge's son." Clara felt heat rising in her face that had nothing to do with the day's temperature. The men were discussing her future with the same pragmatic assessment they might apply to a legal case, weighing evidence and strategic advantages without apparent concern for the personal implications of what Nathaniel proposed. "Gentlemen," she said firmly, regaining her composure, "I appreciate your concern for my reputation. However, I did not travel 2,000 miles to escape one marriage of convenience, only to enter another. Mr. Montgomery's offer is generous but unnecessary." Nathaniel's expression shifted from strategic calculation to something more vulnerable. "Clara, I assure you my proposal isn't merely tactical, despite the circumstances of its delivery." He paused, seeming to search for words that usually came so easily to him in the courtroom. "I've grown to admire you tremendously over these past weeks. Your intelligence, your resilience, your dignity in the face of unfair treatment. These qualities would make any man fortunate to have you as his wife." The sincerity in his voice caught her off guard. Their evening conversations, the gradual sharing of ideas and aspirations, the growing ease between them, all suggested a connection deeper than mere professional association. Yet Clara had deliberately avoided acknowledging any potential for romance, convinced that her scarred appearance and complicated arrival in Cedar Springs placed certain possibilities permanently beyond her reach. "Mr. Montgomery, Nathaniel," she began carefully, "your friendship has been invaluable to me, but perhaps," Judge Montgomery interrupted, his judicial demeanor firmly in place, "this conversation should continue privately between the two of you at a more appropriate time. For now, we have a more immediate matter to resolve regarding Fowler's detention and his libelous materials." Clara seized the reprieve gratefully. "Yes, of course. Sheriff Parker, what options exist for preventing Mr. Fowler from distributing these statements should he secure release?" The sheriff shifted uncomfortably. "Limited ones, I'm afraid. We can't legally prevent a man from sharing his opinions, however misguided, unless they directly incite violence. Most we could do is warn him that subsequent actions might constitute harassment, which would do little to retrieve papers already distributed," Nathaniel observed grimly, apparently willing to set aside his unexpected proposal for the moment. "Once the allegations are public, the damage is done." Judge Montgomery's expression remained thoughtful. "There may be another approach. Sheriff, you mentioned Preston is already in town?" "Yes, sir. Waiting in the main corridor last I saw. Him in. Have him brought in," the judge instructed, "and Mr. Harrison as well, if he's recovered sufficiently from Fowler's assault." As Sheriff Parker departed to summon the attorney and newspaper editor, an awkward silence fell over the judge's chambers. Clara avoided meeting Nathaniel's gaze directly, her thoughts still reeling from his unexpected proposal. For his part, Nathaniel maintained a carefully neutral expression, though the tension in his posture suggested the casual delivery of his offer hadn't reflected the significance he attached to it. Relief came in the form of Edward Harrison, the newspaper editor, entering with a blood-spotted handkerchief held to his swollen lip. Behind him came Lawrence Preston, a sleek, well-dressed gentleman whose immaculate appearance seemed at odds with the frontier setting of Cedar Springs. "Judge Montgomery," Preston began immediately, his smooth voice carrying the polished cadence of Eastern education, "my client is being held without justification. A minor altercation between gentlemen hardly warrants overnight detention." "Assault is more than a minor altercation, Counselor," the judge replied dryly. "And your client's history suggests a pattern of behavior rather than an isolated incident." Harrison lowered his handkerchief, revealing the damage to his face. "He demanded I print allegations about Miss Bennett without any supporting evidence. When I refused, he struck me without warning." The editor's gaze moved to Clara, a mixture of sympathy and journalistic curiosity in his expression. "My paper may be small, Judge, but we maintain standards of verification." Preston dismissed this with an elegant wave of his hand. "My client was understandably frustrated by Mr. Harrison's refusal to print information of public interest regarding a woman who has assumed a position of influence in the community. A position earned through demonstrated competence," Judge Montgomery stated firmly, "unlike the inherited wealth that appears to be Mr. Fowler's primary qualification for respect." The attorney's expression tightened momentarily before smoothing into professional neutrality. "Be that as it may, Your Honor, I must insist on my client's prompt release. The matter can be properly addressed in court if Mr. Harrison wishes to press charges." Clara watched this exchange with growing clarity about what Judge Montgomery intended. The judge was deliberately provoking Preston, establishing positions that would make his eventual compromise appear more reasonable. "Your client remains "In custody, Mr. Preston," Judge Montgomery declared, "not simply for the assault, but because I have reason to believe he intends to commit additional offenses upon release." "Speculation, Your Honor, not evidence," Preston countered smoothly. "You have no legal basis to continue his detention on such grounds." Judge Montgomery leaned forward slightly, his penetrating gaze fixed on the attorney. "Perhaps, but I do have discretion regarding bail amounts, which I intend to set at a level reflecting the seriousness with which I view attacks on members of this court staff." Mayor Preston's confident expression faltered slightly. "Staff? Miss Bennett is merely your household employee, as I understand it." "Miss Bennett serves as my legal assistant and clerk," the judge corrected coldly. "Her role includes handling confidential court documents and preparing legal opinions. Mr. Fowler's campaign against her constitutes interference with court operations, a matter I take extremely seriously." Clara observed the strategic elevation of her position with quiet admiration. The judge was establishing legal grounds for protecting her that extended beyond personal concern, creating a professional shield that even Preston would hesitate to challenge directly. "I see," Preston said carefully. "Nevertheless, my client has the right to express his opinions regarding individuals in the community, provided he does so without actual malice." "Actual malice seems abundantly evident in this case," Nathaniel interjected, his legal training evident in his precise terminology. "Mr. Fowler has no factual basis for his allegations, which he continues to pursue despite knowing their falsehood, with the specific intent to damage Miss Bennett's reputation." Harrison nodded emphatically, wincing as the movement aggravated his injured lip. He admitted he wanted to teach her a lesson for humiliating him. Those were his exact words. Preston's expression suggested he was re-evaluating his position in light of this testimony. A skilled attorney, he understood when a strategic retreat might serve his client better than continued confrontation. "Perhaps," he offered carefully, "there is room for a mutually acceptable resolution. My client's primary concern is the perception that he behaved dishonorably during the wedding incident. If a statement could be published clarifying the circumstances." "Absolutely not," Clara interjected, unable to remain silent while her humiliation was negotiated as a bargaining chip. "I will not participate in any public discussion of that day to soothe Mr. Fowler's wounded pride." Preston turned toward her, seeming to truly see her for the first time. His gaze lingered briefly on her scarred cheek before meeting her eyes with the calculated assessment of a man accustomed to identifying leverage. "Miss Bennett, I understand your reluctance. However, consider the practical benefits of resolving this matter quickly and quietly. Prolonged conflict serves neither party's interests." "I have no interest in conflict at all, Mr. Preston," Clara replied evenly. "It is your client who has chosen to pursue vengeance for an imagined slight. I simply wish to continue my work without harassment." Judge Montgomery cleared his throat. "Mr. Preston, I propose the following arrangement. Mr. Fowler will remain in custody until tomorrow's hearing. Should he agree to cease his defamatory activities and leave Cedar Springs immediately thereafter, I would be inclined toward leniency regarding the assault charges. Should he refuse, I will set bail at a figure that ensures he remains detained until a full trial can be arranged, a matter of weeks given the court's current schedule." The implied threat was clear: cooperate or face extended imprisonment in the small, uncomfortable jail cell beneath the courthouse. Preston recognized the ultimatum for what it was, his lips thinning with professional displeasure at having his negotiating position undermined. "I'll convey your proposal to my client, Your Honor," he said stiffly, "though I must register my objection to what appears to be judicial coercion." "Noted," the judge replied dryly. "Sheriff Parker will escort you to the holding cells." After Preston departed with the sheriff, Harrison turned to Clara with unexpected warmth. "Miss Bennett, I want you to know that the Gazette would never print unsubstantiated allegations against anyone in our community, regardless of their position. Journalistic integrity demands verification." Clara appreciated the editor's principled stance, especially given the physical price he had paid for it. "Thank you, Mr. Harrison. Your professional standards are commendable." Once Harrison had been dismissed to have his injuries properly tended, the three of them remained in the judge's chambers, the tension of the earlier proposal hanging unresolved between them. "Will Preston convince Fowler to accept your terms?" Clara asked, deliberately, steering the conversation toward practical matters. "Most likely," Judge Montgomery replied. "Preston is a skilled attorney who recognizes when a strategic retreat serves his client better than continued confrontation. Fowler may bluster, but ultimately he'll follow legal counsel." Nathaniel had moved to the window, gazing out at the sun-baked town square with unusual stillness. "And if he doesn't? If he chooses to distribute his libelous materials despite the consequences?" "Then we address that challenge when it arises," the judge said firmly. "One battle at a time, Nathaniel. It's how justice progresses, not in sweeping victories, but in steady, incremental advances against ignorance and prejudice." Clara recognized the statement as the judge's oblique reference to her potential preparation for the bar examination. A long-term goal, not to be abandoned because of temporary obstacles. His confidence in her ability to overcome both legal and social barriers touched her deeply. "I should return to the house," she said, gathering her composure. "There's correspondence regarding the Miller estate that requires attention before tomorrow's mail collection." Judge Montgomery nodded approvingly at her focus on duty despite the morning's tumult. "Very well, Miss Bennett. I'll remain here to oversee Preston's discussion with his client. Nathaniel will escort you home." The instruction left no room for the private conversation Clara knew must eventually occur between herself and Nathaniel regarding his impulsive proposal. For once, she was grateful for the judge's decisive manner and its postponement of a difficult discussion. The walk back to the Montgomery house was undertaken in uncharacteristic silence, the midday heat providing convenient excuse to conserve energy and words. Nathaniel maintained a proper distance beside her, his expression thoughtful rather than wounded, suggesting he understood her need for time to process his unexpected offer. Only as they reached the garden gate did he finally speak. "Clara, I apologize for the abrupt nature of my proposal earlier. The circumstances were far from ideal." "The circumstances were what they were," she replied carefully. "Your instinct to protect me was admirable, if unnecessary." Nathaniel's expression grew more intent. "My instinct wasn't merely protective, though I recognize how it must have appeared. The situation with Fowler simply forced me to voice considerations I've been contemplating for some time." Clara felt her heart quicken despite her determination. To maintain practical perspective, "Nathaniel, You don't need to respond now," he interrupted gently. "Indeed, I would prefer you didn't, until I can present my case more appropriately." A hint of his usual warmth returned to his expression. "Any proper legal argument requires thorough preparation and the right setting." Despite herself, Clara smiled at his analogy. "Ever the attorney." "It's how I make sense of the world," he admitted, "though I'm finding that some matters transcend legal reasoning, however carefully applied." The simple statement contained layers of meaning that Clara wasn't prepared to fully examine. Instead, she nodded slightly. "I should attend to the Miller estate correspondence." "Of course." Nathaniel stepped back, respecting the boundary she had established. We'll speak again when this situation with Fowler is resolved. Some conversations deserve freedom from such distractions." As Clara watched him stride back toward the courthouse, his tall figure moving with purpose despite the oppressive heat, she acknowledged the complex emotions his proposal had stirred within her. Beyond the practical considerations, beyond the strategic advantages it might offer against Fowler's malice, lay questions she had deliberately avoided since arriving. In Cedar Springs, could someone truly see beyond her scars to the woman beneath? Could she trust such acceptance, or would it inevitably give way to regret or resentment? And perhaps most challenging, could she risk her hard-won independence for the uncertain promise of partnership, even with someone as principled as Nathaniel Montgomery? These questions followed her into the cool interior of the house, where Sarah met her with concern evident in her usually composed features. "Is everything all right? Miss Bennett, the judge, is handling matters at the courthouse," Clara assured her. "Mr. Fowler's attorney has arrived and negotiations are underway." She removed her hat, feeling the relief of the house's relative coolness after the punishing sun. "I'll be working on the Miller correspondence in the study if I'm needed." Immersing herself in routine tasks offered temporary refuge from the turbulence of the morning's events. The Miller estate matter involved straightforward legal procedures, inventorying assets, notifying potential heirs, preparing necessary documents for the judge's review. Clara lost herself in the precise language of legal formulations, finding comfort in their ordered structure and clear purpose. Yet underneath this focused productivity, her mind continued processing the day's developments. Fowler's vindictive attempt to destroy her reputation, the judge's strategic intervention, and most unsettling of all, Nathaniel's unexpected proposal. Each required a response she wasn't yet prepared to formulate. Decisions that would shape her future in Cedar Springs in ways she couldn't fully anticipate. For now, she would focus on what lay directly before her, the work that had earned her a place in the judge's household, the competence that had gradually won respect from the courthouse staff, the steady building of a life defined by her own choices rather than others' judgments. The rest would need to wait until tomorrow brought clarity regarding Fowler's intentions and her own carefully guarded heart. The courthouse was unusually crowded for a weekday morning. Word of Jeremiah Fowler's detention and the confrontation with Edward Harrison had spread through Cedar Springs with the efficiency of a well-organized telegraph system, drawing curious onlookers, hoping to witness the next chapter in what had become the town's most compelling drama. Clara sat beside Nathaniel in the second row of the gallery, her posture rigid despite the supportive presence beside her. She had chosen a high-necked blue dress with white trim, deliberately selecting an outfit that projected both dignity and propriety. If her character was to be the subject of public scrutiny, she would present herself with unwavering composure. "Preston spent nearly 2 hours with Fowler yesterday afternoon," Nathaniel murmured, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "Sheriff Parker reports they argued intensely before reaching some decision." Clara nodded slightly, keeping her expression neutral despite the tension coiling within her. "Whatever Mr. Fowler decides, I am prepared to face it directly." Nathaniel's hand moved briefly toward hers before he caught himself, mindful of the watchful eyes surrounding them. "You won't face it alone." Before she could respond, the side door opened to admit Judge Montgomery, his black robes lending gravity to his already imposing presence. Despite the previous day's exertions and the continuing heat, he moved with deliberate dignity to the bench, showing no sign of the physical discomfort Clara knew he must be experiencing. "All rise," Sheriff Parker called, and the rustling of fabric filled the courtroom as the spectators stood. Once seated, Judge Montgomery surveyed the crowded room with obvious disapproval. "This hearing concerns a simple assault charge, not public entertainment. Those with no direct connection to the proceedings are encouraged to find more productive uses for their time. Despite this clear dismissal, few moved toward the exit. The judge's scowl deepened, but he proceeded without further comment on the audience. The court calls the case of Cedar Springs versus Jeremiah Fowler on the charge of assault against Edward Harrison, he announced formally. Sheriff, bring in the defendant. Fowler entered between two deputies, his normally imposing figure diminished by the night spent in the holding cell. His clothing was rumpled, his expression thunder dark as he took his place beside Lawrence. Preston at the defendant's table. Clara noted with clinical detachment that he deliberately avoided looking in her direction. Mr. Preston, Judge Montgomery began, I understand your client wishes to enter a plea regarding the assault charge. The attorney rose smoothly, his Eastern tailoring and polished manner standing out amid the frontier setting. Yes, Your Honor. After careful consideration, Mr. Fowler wishes to plead guilty to simple assault and throw himself on the mercy of the court. A murmur rippled through the spectators. Clara remained perfectly still, recognizing this as the first move in whatever strategy Preston and Fowler had devised overnight. And does Mr. Fowler wish to make a statement regarding this plea? The judge inquired, his tone suggesting he anticipated what would follow. He does, Your Honor. Preston gestured, and Fowler rose beside him, squaring his shoulders in a visible effort to reclaim his dignity. Your Honor, Fowler began, his voice carrying the rough edge of a man unaccustomed to public apologies. I regret my actions toward Mr. Harrison. My behavior was unbecoming of a businessman and citizen of Cedar Springs. The carefully crafted statement rang with Preston's lawyerly phrasing rather than Fowler's natural speech, making its sincerity questionable at best. Judge Montgomery's expression remained impassive, waiting for the inevitable continuation. I've been experiencing significant distress following recent personal disappointments, Fowler continued, finally allowing his gaze to slide toward Clara before returning to the judge. While this doesn't excuse my behavior, I hope the court will consider these circumstances when determining an appropriate penalty. Clara felt, rather than saw, the courthouse spectators turning to observe her reaction. She maintained her composed expression, refusing to give them the satisfaction of visible discomfort. Judge Montgomery tapped his fingers thoughtfully on the bench. Mr. Harrison, as the injured party, do you wish to address the court regarding this matter? The newspaper editor rose from his seat near the front. The bruising on his face now developed into impressive purple-yellow patterns that testified to the force of Fowler's blow. Your Honor, while I appreciate Mr. Fowler's acknowledgement of wrongdoing, I remain concerned about the circumstances that precipitated the assault. Elaborate, please, the judge instructed. Mr. Fowler was attempting to publish defamatory statements about Miss Bennett, Harrison stated plainly. When I refused without proper verification, he resorted to violence. My concern is that accepting this apology without addressing the underlying issue leaves Miss Bennett vulnerable to continued character assassination through other means. Fowler's face darkened, but Preston placed a restraining hand on his arm, leaning close to whisper something that kept his client seated despite his obvious anger. A valid concern, Judge Montgomery acknowledged. Mr. Preston, does your client wish to address this aspect of the situation as well? The attorney rose again, his expression carefully controlled. Your Honor, my client's guilty plea concerns only the physical altercation with Mr. Harrison. The content of private communications between citizens falls outside the court's jurisdiction, as I'm sure you're aware. I'm aware of many things, Counselor, the judge replied dryly, including the distinction between protected opinion and deliberate defamation with malicious intent. Preston's polished composure showed a momentary crack before he recovered. Nevertheless, Your Honor, The issue before the court today is simple assault, not potential future actions that may or may not occur. Judge Montgomery's penetrating gaze remained fixed on the attorney. True. However, the court has an interest in preventing repeated offenses. Mr. Fowler's stated distress over personal disappointments suggests a pattern that might continue without intervention. The legal maneuvering fascinated Clara despite her personal stake in its outcome. Both men were engaged in careful verbal fencing, establishing positions without explicitly stating the underlying concerns that everyone in the courtroom understood perfectly well. "Your Honor," Preston responded smoothly, "my client has no intention of creating further disturbances in Cedar Springs. In fact, he plans to depart for Denver on tomorrow morning's stage to pursue business opportunities there." This announcement caused another ripple of whispers through the gallery. Fowler's permanent departure would significantly alter the social landscape of Cedar Springs, where his wealth and ranch operations had made him an influential figure despite his difficult personality. "I see," Judge Montgomery said, his tone suggesting he had anticipated this development. "And does this departure indicate Mr. Fowler is abandoning his property interests in the region?" Preston glanced briefly at his client before responding. "Mr. Fowler has arranged for his foreman to manage the ranch while he considers offers from several interested buyers. His long-term plans remain undetermined." The judge nodded thoughtfully. "Very well. Given these circumstances, the court accepts Mr. Fowler's guilty plea for the assault on Mr. Harrison." He fixed Fowler with a penetrating stare. "The sentence is a fine of $50, payable immediately to the court, plus compensation of $25 to Mr. Harrison for medical expenses and lost work time." The sentence was substantial, but not excessive, a careful balance that gave Fowler a face-saving exit while still acknowledging the seriousness of his offense. Clara recognized Judge Montgomery's strategic wisdom in not pushing for harsher punishment that might provoke Fowler to renewed vindictiveness. "Additionally," the judge continued, his voice taking on a harder edge, "the court advises Mr. Fowler that any distribution of defamatory materials concerning citizens of Cedar Springs, whether before or after his departure, would constitute grounds for legal action that could require his return to face charges. I trust this is understood." Fowler's jaw tightened visibly, but Preston answered for him. "Perfectly understood, Your Honor. My client has no intention of engaging in such activities." "Excellent." Judge Montgomery rapped his gavel once. "This matter is resolved. Court is adjourned until 2 o'clock, when we will resume the Miller estate proceedings." As the spectators began filing out, many casting curious glances toward Clara, Nathaniel leaned closer. It appears Preston convinced him that continuing his vendetta would be more costly than satisfying. "A practical consideration rather than a moral epiphany," Clara observed quietly, "though I'll accept the outcome regardless of his motivations." They remained seated as the courtroom emptied, allowing Fowler to depart without forcing an uncomfortable proximity. Clara caught his glance as he passed, a look of cold assessment rather than defeated acceptance. Whatever Preston had convinced him to agree to in court, Jeremiah Fowler's resentment remained undiminished. "He'll leave Cedar Springs," Nathaniel said, reading her thoughts with disconcerting accuracy, "but I doubt he's truly surrendered his grievance." "No," Clara agreed. "He's simply decided the cost of pursuing it here exceeds the satisfaction it would bring. For now, that's sufficient." Judge Montgomery approached them once the courtroom had cleared, having removed his judicial robes in the privacy of his chambers. "Miss Bennett, I trust you found the proceedings satisfactory? The outcome is practical, even if the sincerity behind it is questionable," she replied honestly. "I appreciate your handling of the matter, sir." The judge's weathered features creased with the hint of a smile. Pragmatism often serves justice, better than rigid principle, particularly on the frontier. He leaned slightly on his cane, the only concession to the fatigue Clara knew he must be feeling. Nathaniel, I believe you had mentioned showing Miss Bennett the new territorial statutes that arrived from Denver. This might be an opportune moment, as I'll be occupied with correspondence until the afternoon session. The transparent attempt to provide them privacy for the conversation both knew must occur brought a flush to Clara's cheeks. Nathaniel, however, accepted the suggestion with perfect composure. An excellent idea, Father. The water rights amendments would be particularly relevant to Miss Bennett's preparation for the bar examination. Clara looked up sharply, surprised by this casual reference to what had been a private discussion between herself and the judge. Judge Montgomery merely nodded, as if the matter were already settled rather than merely proposed. Indeed, I've taken the liberty of writing to Judge Harrison about sponsoring your application, Miss Bennett. His response should arrive within the week. Before Clara could formulate a response to this unexpected development, the judge had departed, leaving her alone with Nathaniel and the weight of multiple unresolved conversations. You knew about the bar examination, she said, not quite a question. Nathaniel nodded, his expression serious. Father mentioned it yesterday evening. He's quite determined that your talents shouldn't be wasted simply because convention hasn't caught up with capability. And you agree with him? Clara couldn't keep a note of challenge from her voice. I believe you would make an exceptional attorney, Nathaniel replied without hesitation. Your analytical mind, your compassion, your determination, all are qualities the legal profession desperately needs, particularly in territories still forming their fundamental principles. His sincere assessment touched her deeply, yet uncertainty remained. The practical obstacles are considerable. Even with certification, what judge would allow a woman to argue cases? What clients would trust their legal matters to someone like me? Some wouldn't, Nathaniel acknowledged, but others might. Women seeking divorces from abusive husbands, families with complex inheritance matters, small ranchers needing simple contracts drafted. His blue eyes held conviction rather than naive optimism. Change begins with a single precedent, Clara. Someone must be first. Oh. The courthouse had emptied completely now, leaving them in rare privacy. Clara gathered her courage to address what they had both been avoiding since the previous day. Your proposal yesterday, was it truly motivated by more than strategic consideration of my situation with Fowler? Nathaniel held her gaze steadily. It was precipitated by Fowler's threats, yes, but the thought itself has been with me since our earliest conversations in the library. He moved a step closer, though still maintaining a respectful distance. Your mind challenges mine. Your courage inspires me. Your determination to forge your own path despite obstacles reminds me daily of why my father came west, to build something better than what tradition dictated. And my appearance? Clara couldn't prevent herself from raising a hand to her scarred cheek. Can you honestly say it doesn't matter to you? Your scars matter, Nathaniel replied with unexpected directness, because they're part of what shaped you into the woman standing before me. They represent courage, sacrifice, survival. His voice softened. But they don't define you, Clara. Not to me. The simple sincerity of his response brought unexpected tears to her eyes, not flowery denials or poetic comparisons, but honest acknowledgement of reality paired with deeper understanding. I don't need rescuing, Nathaniel, she said quietly. From Fowler or from spinsterhood or from any other fate convention might assign me. I know. A smile warmed his serious features. That's precisely why I'm asking you to consider a partnership instead. Two independent paths, choosing to run parallel rather than one subsuming the other. The offer was unlike any Clara had expected when she first embarked on her journey west. Neither the practical arrangement she had anticipated with Jeremiah, Fowler, nor the romantic fantasy young girls were taught to desire. Instead, Nathaniel proposed something rarer and more valuable: partnership based on mutual respect and shared purpose. "I would need time," she said finally, "to establish myself professionally before considering personal attachments, to know that any future between us would be built on equality rather than dependence." "The bar examination is in September," Nathaniel replied, understanding immediately. 3 months during which you can focus entirely on preparation and professional development." His expression held no disappointment at her conditional response, only respect for her priorities. "Whatever you decide then, Clara, know that my admiration and support remain unchanged." For the first time since the fire that had claimed her family and marked her face, Clara felt the full possibility of a future unrestricted by others' perceptions or her own protective barriers. Not just professional opportunity through the bar examination, but personal connection built on genuine understanding rather than conventional expectations. "September then," she agreed, a tentative smile forming. "When we've both had time to consider all implications, professional and personal." Nathaniel offered his arm with formal correctness that somehow contained deeper meaning. "Shall we examine those water rights amendments? I believe you'll find the territorial legislature's approach particularly interesting." As they walked together toward the law library, Clara felt a sense of possibility expanding before her, not despite the challenges she had faced since arriving in Cedar Springs, but because of how she had met them. The mail-order bride with the scarred face, rejected and humiliated, had found something more valuable than the marriage she had initially sought: the chance to define herself by her own capabilities rather than others' judgments. Whether her future eventually included Nathaniel Montgomery would be determined by choices made from strength rather than necessity, a freedom she had never anticipated when she first stepped from the stagecoach into the dusty streets of Cedar Springs. The mountain air carried the scent of pine and possibility as they entered the library together, two minds engaged in shared purpose, their paths running parallel toward a horizon neither could fully envision, but both faced with growing confidence. Up next, you got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.